A 16-year-old girl sits trapped in a dying Colorado diner while a blizzard buries the highway outside. The man beside her calls himself her uncle. His hand crushing her knee under the table tells a different story. She has 48 hours before she vanishes from every database in America. And no one is coming to save her. No one except 12 battle-scarred bikers who just pulled out of the storm like ghosts riding thunder. What happens next will shatter everything you think you know about outlaws, justice, and who really protects the forgotten. Stay with this one all the way to the end. I promise you won't be the same after. Drop a like right now and comment your city so I know where you're watching from. Let's ride. The snow started falling around noon and never stopped. By evening, Route 40 through northern Colorado looked like something the world had forgotten existed. Whiteout conditions buried the center line. Wind screamed sideways across open plains, turning the highway into a frozen river of nothing. The few truckers still brave enough to drive were crawling at 30 miles an hour with their hazards flashing orange through the white, their rigs groaning against crosswinds strong enough to push an 18-wheeler into a ditch. Somewhere between Steamboat Springs and Craig, tucked behind a snow-covered Sinclair gas station with a dead pump and a crooked sign, sat a roadside diner called Merle's, the kind of place that only existed anymore because nobody had bothered to tear it down. Cracked linoleum floors the color of old teeth, a jukebox in the corner that only played half its songs, neon beer signs buzzing above the counter like electric insects dying slow. The ceiling tiles were stained brown from decades of cigarette smoke, and the coffee tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration and reheated every 6 hours since. 3 truckers occupied the counter stools, hunched over mugs, saying nothing. A waitress named Darla, mid-50s, varicose veins visible through her stockings, a cigarette tucked behind her ear. She wasn't technically allowed to smoke inside anymore, wiped the same stretch of counter she'd been wiping for 20 minutes. The cook hadn't come out of the kitchen in over an hour. The television above the register played weather warnings on mute, the ticker scrolling the same message over and over. Severe winter storm warning. Avoid travel. Roads closed. Nobody was going anywhere tonight, and that was exactly the problem. In the second-to-last booth near the restroom hallway, a man in a gray insulated jacket sat across from a teenage girl. He looked like anybody's neighbor. Clean-shaven, wire-rimmed glasses, brown hair parted neatly on the left. He smiled at the waitress when she brought coffee and called her ma'am. He kept one hand flat on the table where everyone could see it. His other hand was under the table, locked around the girl's knee, hard enough to leave fingerprints in her skin. The girl's name was Ivy Mercer. She was 16 years old. She had brown hair that hadn't been washed in 3 days and dark circles beneath her eyes that made her look closer to 30. She wore a hoodie 2 sizes too big that didn't belong to her and jeans with mud caked into the cuffs. Her sneakers were soaked through. She hadn't eaten anything solid since Tuesday, and her hands trembled constantly. Not from the cold, though the cold was brutal, but from something much worse. She had been taken from a Greyhound station in Grand Junction 72 hours ago. The man's name, the one he'd given at the bus station, the motel front desk, and the gas station in Rifle, was Dale Mercer. Uncle Dale. That's what he told people when they glanced at the girl beside him. Family emergency. Her mother sick, taking her home to Nebraska. He even had a photograph in his wallet, Ivy as a toddler on someone's lap at a barbecue, printed off a social media page he'd spent weeks mining before choosing her. His real name was Curtis Phelps. 44 years old, no registered address in any state. 3 aliases across 4 jurisdictions, none of them flagged because the warrants were filed in counties that didn't talk to each other. He worked for a network, not the kind with offices and business cards, but the kind that moved girls across state lines using stolen federal credentials, burner phones, prepaid motel rooms, and the terrifying simplicity of a man who looked normal standing next to a child who looked scared but not scared enough for anyone to ask. Nobody ever asked. That was the thing Ivy had learned fastest. At the bus station in Grand Junction, she'd looked directly at a security guard while Curtis gripped her arm. The guard had looked back. Then he'd looked away. At the motel in Rifle, the front desk woman had seen the bruises forming on Ivy's wrist and asked if they needed extra towels. At a gas station somewhere east of Meeker, Ivy had tried to mouth the word help to a woman pumping gas in the next lane. The woman had seen it. Ivy was certain. The woman had gotten back in her minivan and driven away. 3 days. 3 chances. 3 failures. The world was not coming to save Ivy Mercer. The world had looked directly at her and decided she was someone else's problem. Now the blizzard had pinned them inside this diner, and Curtis was getting nervous. She could feel it in the way his grip kept tightening and releasing on her knee, like a pulse. He checked his phone every 2 minutes. He scanned the door every time wind rattled the frame. He'd ordered coffee but hadn't drunk it. He kept touching his waistband with his free hand, a quick brush of his fingertips against something hard beneath his jacket. And each time he did it, Ivy felt something inside her chest collapse a little further. She knew what was under his jacket. She'd seen it when he thought she was sleeping in the motel room, a matte black pistol in a belt holster. He'd checked the magazine, slid it back in, and set it on the nightstand while he made a phone call she wasn't supposed to hear. "Package is delayed," he'd said. "Weather's killing the route. I need another 24 hours. A pause. "She's compliant. No issues." Another pause. Longer. 12 to 14 hours from the handoff point. "Once the highway opens, I can make Ogallala by morning." Then he'd looked at Ivy. She'd kept her eyes shut, her breathing steady, her body perfectly still. Every muscle locked, every nerve screaming, compliant. That word had burned itself into her skull and stayed there for the past 36 hours like a brand. Now, in the diner, the storm was getting worse. The windows shook. The lights flickered twice and held. One of the truckers at the counter muttered something about power lines and got up to check on his rig. The waitress, Darla, refilled coffee without being asked, the glass pot trembling slightly in her hand because even she could feel it, that low-frequency wrongness radiating from the booth near the bathroom. The way the man smiled too easily. The way the girl never smiled at all. The way neither of them had ordered food despite sitting there for over an hour. Darla had worked diners for 31 years. She'd seen runaways. She'd seen custody disputes. She'd seen things she wished she hadn't and done nothing about most of them because that's what people did in places like this. They poured coffee and minded their own survival. But something about this girl's eyes. Something about the way she held her hands in her lap, like she was trying to keep them from shaking apart. Darla almost said something. Almost asked, "Honey, you okay?" Almost picked up the phone behind the register and called the sheriff's non-emergency line. Almost. Then Curtis looked up at her with that clean, reasonable smile, and Darla refilled his coffee and walked away. Ivy watched her go. Whatever fragile hope had been holding her ribs together cracked and went silent. Outside, the storm screamed louder. And then, beneath the scream, another sound. Low, distant, guttural. At first it could have been thunder, could have been a semi-downshifting on the grade. But it didn't fade. It grew. It multiplied. It became a rolling, mechanical growl that vibrated through the frozen parking lot, up through the diner's foundation, and into the soles of Ivy's soaked sneakers. Engines. Not truck engines, not car engines, something older, rawer, something that sounded like it had been dragged out of a war and never came home. Harleys. Through the frost-caked window, Ivy saw headlights punching through the blizzard. 1 pair, then 3, then 6, then more. They moved in formation, tight, disciplined, deliberate, cutting through the storm like something that had decided the weather was irrelevant. Snow swirled in their headlight beams like white fire. Chrome glinted beneath layers of ice and road grime. Every trucker at the counter turned toward the window. Darla stopped wiping. Even the muted television seemed less important. The motorcycles filled the parking lot with sound. Not chaos, rhythm. Engines idling in unison, then dying one by one in sequence, like soldiers reporting for duty. Boots hit frozen asphalt. Leather creaked in the cold. Someone coughed. A lighter clicked. Then the door opened, and cold air flooded the diner along with the smell of exhaust, cigarette smoke, wet leather, and something harder to name. Something that smelled like long roads and no apologies. 12 men. Maybe 13. They came in without hurry, stomping snow from their boots, pulling off gloves with their teeth, shaking ice from their beards. Their leather cuts were worn and scarred, stitched with patches that didn't look like fashion statements. They looked like records, service records, damage records, the kind of patches earned with blood and miles, not purchased online. The words on the back read, Lost Saints MC. No one in the diner recognized the name, but everyone recognized what they were, the way they moved, the way they scanned the room without making it obvious, the way they chose their seats with sight lines to every exit, every window, every stranger. These were not hobbyists. Curtis Phelps felt the shift immediately. His hand froze on Ivy's knee. His eyes tracked the bikers as they filled the back booths, their voices low, their laughter rough and brief. He cataloged them with the efficiency of a man who had spent his career reading rooms, how many, how big, how armed, how dangerous. His right hand drifted to his waistband again, touched the pistol grip, held it for 3 full seconds before letting go. Too many. He leaned close to Ivy. His breath was warm and smelled like stale coffee. "Don't move," he whispered. "Don't talk. Don't look at anyone. We're leaving as soon as I say." Ivy didn't respond. She was watching the man who came in last. He was taller than the others, but carried himself like he was trying to take up less space, not more. Late 40s, maybe early 50s? Hard to tell because the years on his face weren't calendar years. They were damage years. A scar ran from beneath his left eye down to his jawline, pale and surgical against weathered skin. His beard was dark, threaded with silver. His eyes were the color of old concrete, and they moved across the diner with a slow, mechanical patience that missed nothing. Rhett Callahan. The other bikers called him Graves. He'd earned the name in Helmand Province 16 years ago, where he'd spent 3 days pinned in a collapsed building with 2 dead Marines and a radio that didn't work, digging through rubble with his bare hands until his fingers were raw hamburger. The Marine Corps gave him a Silver Star. The VA gave him a prescription. The nightmares gave him everything else. He'd been riding ever since, not toward anything, just away. Away from the apartment that felt like a coffin. Away from the wife who'd left because she couldn't sleep next to a man who screamed through the dark. Away from the version of himself that had died in that building and never fully came back. The Lost Saints weren't a gang. They weren't a brand. They were a collection of men who had been broken by the same machine and found that the only thing that kept the noise quiet was the sound of engines on open road. Half of them were veterans. The other half were ex-cons, former addicts, men who'd lost custody of their children, men whose families had given up on them, men who'd spent time in places they didn't talk about and come out carrying weight they'd never set down. Graves took the last seat in the back booth, his shoulders nearly touching the men on either side of him. Darla appeared with a coffee pot and poured without asking. Graves wrapped both hands around the mug like he was holding something alive. The warmth seeped into his cracked knuckles, into the scar tissue across his palms, into the parts of him that hadn't been warm in years. He didn't notice the girl right away. He noticed the man first. 30 feet away, second to last booth, gray insulated jacket, sitting across from a teenager who looked like she hadn't slept in days. The man's posture was wrong, too controlled, too aware. He kept checking his phone, kept touching his waistband. His smile was a mask fitted over something predatory. And Graves had seen that exact mask on enough faces and enough places to recognize it the way a dog recognizes a snake. Then he noticed the girl's hands. They were shaking, not from the cold. He took a slow sip of coffee and said nothing. 2 booths over, Luca Knox was already watching too. Luca was 29, wiry, with a shaved head and tattoos crawling up both sides of his neck like vines. He'd done 4 years in Cannon City for aggravated assault, beat a man half to death outside a bar in Pueblo after the man's girlfriend showed up at the ER for the 3rd time in 2 months, with injuries she kept calling accidents. Luca had a temper that ran on a hair trigger and a hatred for predators that bordered on pathological. His older sister had disappeared from a truck stop in Amarillo when she was 17. They found her body 9 months later in a drainage canal outside El Paso. Nobody was ever arrested. Luca didn't talk about his sister. He didn't need to. Every man in the club knew the story, and every man in the club understood why Luca's hands were already balling into fists beneath the table as he watched the man in the gray jacket grip the girl's knee. "Graves," Luca said quietly. "I see it. His waistband." "I know." Luca's jaw tightened. "That girl hasn't touched her water." Graves set his coffee down. "Easy. We watch." The diner settled into a tense equilibrium. Bikers in the back, truckers at the counter, a predator and his prey in the booth near the bathroom, snow piling against the windows, the jukebox cycling through songs nobody was listening to, the neon beer signs casting everything in a sickly amber wash that made the whole room look like a photograph from a decade nobody wanted to remember. Ivy Mercer felt the equilibrium differently. She felt it like pressure, like the air before a lightning strike. Something had changed in the room when the bikers came in. Some invisible frequency had shifted, and she could feel it humming in her chest, even though she couldn't name it. She glanced toward the back booths. The scarred one, the one with the silver in his beard, was looking at her. Not staring, not leering, looking. The way a doctor looks at an injury before deciding how bad it is. The way a soldier looks at a perimeter before deciding if it's safe. Calm, assessing, patient. Curtis noticed her glancing. His grip tightened. Eyes down. Ivy looked down at the table, at the napkin beside her untouched water glass, at the pen Darla had accidentally left beside the check holder. Something stirred in her chest. Not hope. She'd burned through hope 2 days ago. Something colder. Something more desperate. A calculation. She picked up the pen slowly, keeping her hand below the table. She pulled the napkin onto her lap. She pressed the pen to the paper and wrote 4 words. He's not my family. The ink smeared because her hand was shaking so badly the pen wouldn't track straight. She wrote it again, harder this time, pressing until the napkin nearly tore. He's not my family. Curtis shifted beside her, reaching for his phone. He wasn't looking. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, his attention was on the screen, reading a message, his thumb scrolling. Ivy slid out of the booth. Bathroom, she whispered. Curtis grabbed her arm. His fingers dug into the soft tissue above her elbow, and she had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from crying out. He searched her face for something. Defiance, maybe. A plan. Whatever he was looking for, he didn't find it. She'd gotten very good at making her face say nothing. He let go. Ivy stood. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She walked toward the restroom hallway on autopilot, clutching the napkin so tightly her knuckles went white. She had to pass the back booths to get there. She had to pass the bikers. She had to pass him, the one with the scar and the concrete eyes. She was 4 steps from the booth when she stumbled. It was deliberate, though it looked accidental, her wet sneaker catching the edge of a floor tile. She lurched sideways, caught herself on the edge of Graves' table, and in that fraction of a second, her fingers opened and the napkin landed on the table beside his coffee mug. Sorry, she breathed. Sorry. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. If she looked at him and saw indifference, she would break apart completely. She kept walking, pushed through the restroom door, locked it, and collapsed. She slid down the wall to the cold tile floor and pressed both hands over her mouth to muffle the sound that came out of her. Not a scream, not a sob, but something between both. The sound of a person who has held everything inside for 3 days and can't hold it for 1 more second. Her whole body shook. Tears ran down her face and she didn't wipe them because her hands were still clamped over her mouth, still trying to keep herself silent because silence was the only weapon she had left. Back at the booth, Graves looked down at the napkin. The letters were jagged, smeared, barely legible, written by a hand that couldn't stop trembling. He's not my family. The noise in Graves' head, the permanent low-frequency hum that had lived behind his eyes since Helmand, the sound of rubble shifting and radios screaming static and men calling for help that wasn't coming, went silent. Completely silent. For the first time in 16 years, his mind was clear. He folded the napkin carefully, slid it into his cut pocket, picked up his coffee, and took a long, steady sip. Then he looked at Luca. Luca had already read it over his shoulder. His face was white. His hands were shaking. Not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Nobody moves yet, Graves said, his voice barely above a whisper. We don't know what he's carrying beyond the waistband piece. We don't know if there's a second vehicle outside. We don't know if he's alone. I don't care what he's carrying. I know you don't. That's why I'm telling you to sit still. Luca's teeth ground together so hard the sound was audible. Graves looked at the man in the gray jacket. The man was checking his phone again, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking toward the restroom hallway with increasing impatience, waiting for the girl to come back. Graves turned to the biker on his left, a massive, quiet man named Dutch, former Army combat medic, who hadn't spoken more than 50 words in the past week. "Cover the back exit. If there's a vehicle running, I want to know." Dutch stood without a word and walked toward the kitchen. Graves turned to his right. "Possum, take the lot. Tell me what's parked, how many plates, anything that doesn't look like it belongs to a trucker or that waitress." A lanky biker with a graying ponytail and a limp from an old rodeo injury slid out of the booth and headed for the front door. "Rest of you," Graves said, looking around the booth at faces he'd ridden beside through thunderstorms and funerals and bar fights and hospital rooms. "Stay exactly where you are. Drink your coffee. Look bored. And when I stand up, you stand up." The girl came out of the restroom. Her eyes were red. Her face was wet. She tried to clean up in the mirror, but the evidence was still there. The desperation, the exhaustion, the fractured look of someone operating on pure survival instinct. She walked back toward the booth with her head down. But as she passed Graves, something happened. She slowed. Just slightly. A half step. And her eyes, for the briefest moment, met his. Graves gave her nothing. No nod, no smile, no signal. But he held her gaze for exactly 1 second, and in that second he made a decision that would change both their lives. Ivy sat back down. Curtis seized her arm immediately, pulling her close. "You were gone too long. Line for the bathroom." "There's nobody in there." "I was sick." Curtis studied her. Something in his expression shifted, the mask slipping, just a centimeter revealing the flat reptilian calculation underneath. He leaned in until his lips nearly touched her ear. "We're leaving in 5 minutes. You walk beside me. You smile. You don't say a word. You understand what happens if you make noise." She understood. She understood that nobody in this diner would stop him. The truckers hadn't. The waitress hadn't. The security guard in Grand Junction hadn't. The motel clerk hadn't. The woman at the gas station hadn't. 3 days of proof that the world would watch a girl disappear and do nothing. Curtis stood. He dropped a 20 on the table, took Ivy's arm, and started walking toward the door. Every biker in the back booth saw it happen. The grip, the girl's face, the way she moved like someone being led to an execution. Luca started to rise. Graves put a hand on his shoulder and pushed him back down without looking at him. Then Graves stood. He walked to the front of the diner slowly, unhurried, his boots heavy on the linoleum, his leather cut creaking with each step. He passed the counter where Darla stood frozen with the coffee pot. He passed the truckers who suddenly found their mugs extremely interesting. He walked past the jukebox, past the gumball machine, past the faded health inspection certificate on the wall. And he stopped directly in front of the exit. His body filled the door frame. 6'2", 230 pounds, scarred face, dead calm eyes, arms at his sides. Not aggressive, not threatening, just present, immovable. A wall of leather and scar tissue and silence standing between a predator and the storm outside. Curtis stopped 3 feet from him. Ivy was tucked against his side, his hand locked around her upper arm. The diner was so quiet that Ivy could hear the snow hitting the windows and the buzz of the neon Coors sign and her own heartbeat hammering against her ribs. Graves looked at Curtis, then he looked at Ivy, then back at Curtis. "She coming willingly?" Graves asked. His voice was calm, conversational, like he was asking about the weather. Curtis smiled. The good smile, the one that worked on bus station security guards and motel clerks and gas station strangers. "We're family. She's my niece. I'm taking her home." Graves didn't move. "Long drive in a storm," he said. "Girl looks tired." "She's fine." "Didn't ask you. Asked if she's coming willingly." Curtis's smile thinned. He reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand, slowly, deliberately, and produced a leather badge case. He flipped it open to reveal a federal credential. Blue background, gold seal. Photo ID that looked real enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking for the almost invisible misalignment of the laminate edge. "Federal Marshal," Curtis said. "Protective custody transport. I need you to step aside." The credential hung in the air between them. It was a perfect fake. It had fooled state troopers and motel managers and a Greyhound bus driver in Grand Junction. It would fool anyone in this diner. Anyone except a man who had spent 18 months working with actual federal agents during a joint task force operation in Kandahar and knew exactly what a real credential looked like. Graves stared at the badge. His expression didn't change. The silence in the diner was absolute. Then Ivy spoke. Her voice came out broken and barely audible, cracked from 3 days of silence and fear and swallowed screams. It was the voice of a person who had stopped believing anyone would listen but couldn't stop herself from trying one more time. "Please," she whispered, "please don't let him take me." 5 words that detonated in the silence like a grenade. Graves' eyes moved from the badge to Curtis's face, and something in those concrete-colored eyes shifted. Something cold and final, clicking into place like a round being chambered. Behind him, every biker in the back booth stood at once. 12 chairs scraped against linoleum in unison. The sound filled the diner like a war drum. Curtis Phelps looked past Graves and saw 12 men standing. 12 scarred, silent, stone-faced men in black leather spread across the width of the diner like a wall. No weapons drawn, no shouting, just standing, watching, waiting. His hand moved toward his waistband, and everything that happened next happened in less than 4 seconds. Luca Knox came off the back booth like a detonation. He covered 30 feet of diner floor in a dead sprint, vaulted the counter edge, and caught Curtis's gun hand just as the pistol cleared the holster. Luca smashed Curtis's wrist against the edge of the Formica counter with a sound like a tree branch snapping. The pistol discharged once, a deafening crack that punched a hole in the ceiling tile and rained down plaster dust like dirty snow. Darla screamed. A trucker dove off his stool. Coffee mug shattered on the floor. Curtis howled and swung with his free hand, catching Luca across the jaw. Luca absorbed it like it was nothing and drove his knee into Curtis's stomach, doubling him over. The pistol clattered across the linoleum and skidded under the jukebox. Graves moved then, not fast, but final. He seized Curtis by the back of the neck and the belt and slammed him face first into the floor with the kind of controlled, devastating force that only comes from years of training and years of rage kept on a very short leash. Curtis's glasses shattered, his forehead split open on the linoleum. He tried to get up and Graves put a boot on his spine and pressed down until the man went flat and still. "Don't," Graves said quietly. Just the one word. Curtis didn't move again. While this happened, while the diner erupted in noise and broken glass and the sharp chemical smell of gunpowder, the remaining bikers did something no one expected. They surrounded Ivy. Not touching her, not grabbing her, not even speaking to her. They simply formed a wall of bodies between her and the violence, facing outward, their backs to her, shielding her from having to see any of it. One of them, an older rider named Bishop with a white beard and hands that trembled from decades of hard drinking, shrugged off his leather cut and held it out behind him without turning around. "Put this on if you're cold," he said to the wall. "You don't gotta look at us." Ivy stood behind that wall of broken men and couldn't breathe, not from fear, from something she didn't have a name for yet. Something enormous and unfamiliar rising in her chest like floodwater, something she hadn't felt in 3 days, something she'd convinced herself didn't exist anymore. Someone was standing between her and the dark. Someone had finally stood between her and the dark. Graves pulled Curtis's arms behind his back and zip-tied his wrists with a cable tie from his saddlebag kit. He did it calmly, methodically, without anger. At least not the kind of anger you could see. The kind of anger Graves carried lived deeper than his face. It lived in the scar tissue and the sleepless nights and the sound of rubble that never stopped shifting in his memory. "Possum!" he called. The lanky biker came in from outside, snow covering his shoulders. "Gray Dodge Ram, Nebraska plates. Engine still running, GPS unit mounted on the dash. Burner phones, 3 of them, in the center console. And Graves," he paused. "There's a second set of zip ties in the glove box. Industrial ones, the kind you don't buy at a hardware store." The diner went quiet again. A different kind of quiet. The kind where everyone in the room understands exactly what they're looking at and wishes they didn't. Graves looked at the zip ties already on Curtis's wrists, then at Ivy, then at the ceiling. He pulled out a phone, not a burner, his own, and dialed the Routt County Sheriff's Department. "This is Rhett Callahan off Route 40 at Merle's Diner. I've got a man in custody who was transporting a minor against her will using fabricated federal credentials. He's armed, restrained, and not going anywhere. The girl is safe. Send everyone you've got." He hung up. Then he looked at Luca, who was standing over Curtis with blood on his knuckles and a wildness in his eyes that was 30 seconds from becoming something irreversible. "Luca, don't. Walk away." He had industrial zip ties in his truck, Graves. "You know what those are for." "I know exactly what those are for. And I need you to walk away before you do something that puts you back inside and leaves nobody riding with this club who gives a damn about girls like her." Luca stood there breathing, his chest heaving, his fists clenched so tight the tattoos on his forearms looked like they were writhing. Then he turned, walked past the wall of bikers, walked past Ivy without looking at her, because he knew if he saw her face, he would turn around and kill the man on the floor with his bare hands, and mean it. He pushed through the front door into the blizzard and stood in the parking lot with snow pouring over him, his head tipped back, his eyes closed, his mouth open, letting the cold fill his lungs until the fire inside him dropped below the kill line. Inside, Graves crouched beside Curtis Phelps. The man's face was a mess. Broken nose, shattered glasses, blood pooling on the linoleum. His eyes were open, staring sideways at Graves with the flat, unblinking calculation of a man already composing his legal defense. Graves leaned close. "I know what you are," he said, so quietly that only Curtis could hear. "And I know there are more of you. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell the police everything. Every name, every route, every pickup point, every handoff. And if you don't, I'm going to make it my personal project to find every person in your network and make sure they know you're the one who got caught. You understand what people like them do to liabilities?" Curtis said nothing, but his face went gray. Graves stood and walked toward the back of the diner, toward the wall of bikers still standing around a 16-year-old girl who was wearing an old man's leather cut over her hoodie and shaking so hard the patches rattled. He didn't approach her directly. He stopped 10 feet away and lowered himself into a booth, giving her space, giving her choice. He'd learned a long time ago, in places he didn't talk about, with people who'd been through things he couldn't fix, that the most important thing you could give someone who'd had their choices stolen was the chance to make one. "My name's Rhett," he said. "You don't have to talk to me. You don't have to talk to anybody. But nobody in this room is going to let that man near you again." Ivy stared at him from behind the wall of bikers. Her eyes were swollen. Her lip was split where she'd bitten it to keep from screaming 3 days ago. Bishop's leather cut hung past her knees. She opened her mouth to speak, and then the diner door burst open. 2 men in plain clothes, badges on chains around their necks, one of them shouting, "Federal agents," while the other swept a weapon toward the back of the room. They didn't look at Curtis on the floor. They looked at Graves. They looked at the bikers. "Everybody on the ground, now!" And Ivy realized, with a horror so complete it turned her entire body to ice, that she recognized one of them. He'd been on Curtis's phone, in a photograph. Standing beside Curtis in what looked like a parking garage, both of them smiling. These weren't rescuers. They were part of the network. And they just walked into the only place she'd felt safe in 3 days. The 2 men stood inside the doorframe with snow swirling behind them and weapons drawn, their badges catching the neon light in a way that made the gold look almost orange. The one on the left was stocky, mid-40s, with a shaved head and a neck thicker than his skull. The one on the right was taller, leaner, with a salt and pepper goatee and eyes that moved too fast, scanning the room, the bikers, the girl, the man bleeding on the floor, processing everything at once with the cold efficiency of someone trained to control situations, not resolve them. "Federal agents," the stocky one said again. "Everybody down, hands visible." Nobody in the diner moved. Graves sat perfectly still in his booth, his coffee mug halfway to his lips, his eyes locked on the taller agent, the one Ivy had recognized, the one from Curtis's phone. The calculation behind Graves' expression was invisible to everyone except Luca, who had come back inside from the storm with snow melting in his eyebrows, and his hands still trembling from the cold and something worse. Luca saw Graves' jaw tighten, a millimeter, maybe less. But he'd been reading that jaw for 6 years on the road, and he knew what it meant. Something's wrong. I said down, the stocky agent repeated. He took 2 steps forward, his weapon trained on the cluster of bikers near the back. All of you, on the floor, hands behind your heads. Darla dropped the coffee pot. It shattered on the linoleum, spraying brown liquid across her shoes. She pressed herself against the back wall behind the register with both hands raised, her face the color of flour. One of the truckers, a big man in a Peterbilt cap, slid off his stool slowly and lay face down on the floor without being told twice. The other 2 followed. In 30 seconds, the civilian half of the diner was flat on the ground, eyes shut, breathing hard, doing exactly what Americans have been trained to do when men with guns and badges start shouting. The bikers did not get on the floor. 12 men stood exactly where they'd been standing, forming a loose semicircle around Ivy Mercer, who was pressed against the back wall in Bishop's oversized leather cut, with her arms wrapped around herself so tightly her fingernails were cutting crescents into her own biceps. Graves set his coffee down, slowly. The ceramic clicked against the tabletop like a period at the end of a sentence. You got names? He asked. The stocky one flashed his badge again. Special Agent Dolan, U.S. Marshals. This is Deputy Hale. We're here for the girl. Funny, so is he. Graves nodded toward Curtis Phelps, who lay zip-tied on the floor with blood drying on his shattered face. Showed us federal credentials, too. His were fake. Dolan's eyes dropped to Curtis for exactly 1 second. 1 second too short. A real federal agent walking into a scene with a restrained suspect would assess the suspect first. Injuries, breathing, consciousness, threat level. It was protocol. It was instinct. Dolan skipped all of it. He looked at Curtis the way you look at a flat tire on someone else's car. An inconvenience, not a crisis. Graves caught it. Root County Sheriff's on the way, Graves said. Called them myself. Should be here in 20, maybe 30, with the storm. Why don't we all just wait? That's not how this works. The taller one, Hale, spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, controlled, almost gentle, which made it worse. The girl is part of an active federal case, protective custody transfer. We have paperwork, jurisdiction, and authority. The man on the floor is a fugitive we've been tracking for 3 weeks. You restrained him. Fine, we appreciate the assist, but she comes with us. Now. It was a good speech, rehearsed, polished, every word calibrated to sound reasonable in a room full of people who wanted the situation to end. Ivy made a sound, small, almost inaudible, the kind of sound a person makes when the last door they thought was open starts swinging shut. Graves heard it. Girl stays until the sheriff arrives, he said. If your paperwork is real, you can sort it out with local law enforcement. That's how it works. Dolan took another step forward. His weapon was still drawn, but it had drifted. Not pointed at anyone specifically, just held at a low ready that could become a direct aim in half a heartbeat. You're obstructing a federal operation. I'm sitting in a diner drinking coffee. You assaulted a suspect. I restrained a man who drew a firearm in a room full of civilians and was transporting a minor with fabricated credentials. Your suspect, who you say you've been tracking, in a blizzard, on a closed highway, to a diner you couldn't have known he'd stop at unless you were already on his route. The sentence landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spread through the silence. Even the truckers on the floor seemed to stop breathing. Hale's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes recalibrated. A flicker. The briefest micro-adjustment of a man realizing he's been read by someone smarter than the room was supposed to contain. Luca stepped forward from the side of the biker wall. He didn't say a word. He just moved, positioning himself between Hale and the booth where Ivy sat, his body angled slightly, his weight on his front foot, his hands loose at his sides. The posture of a man who has been in enough fights to know that the first 2 seconds determine everything. Kid, Dolan addressed Luca directly. Don't be stupid. Haven't started. You're looking at federal obstruction charges. All of you. Every patch-wearing biker in this room is 30 seconds from a cell. A Dutch emerged from the kitchen hallway. The massive former combat medic filled the frame the way a boulder fills a creek, silent, impassible, and utterly indifferent to whatever was flowing around him. He'd gone to check the back exit on Graves' orders and had been standing in the kitchen for the last 3 minutes, listening to every word through the service window. Backlot's clear, Dutch said, addressing Graves. No federal vehicles, no second unit, no support. The words hung in the stale diner air. No federal vehicles. Dolan's face went very still. Two men claiming to be federal agents conducting a high-priority protective custody transfer in a severe winter storm with no transport vehicle, no backup unit, and no visible support infrastructure. They'd arrived on foot, or close to it, which meant they'd either been dropped off, parked far enough away to stay hidden, or had been riding in the same vehicle as the man they claimed to be tracking. None of those options were consistent with the story they were telling. All of them were consistent with something much worse. Graves stood. The booth creaked as his weight left it. He rose to his full height, slow, deliberate, the way a man stands when he's stopped calculating whether a fight will happen and started calculating how it will end. "Here's what I think," Graves said, and his voice had dropped into a register so low it was almost subterranean, a frequency you felt in your sternum before your ears processed it. "I think you're not marshals. I think your friend on the floor missed his check-in window, and you came looking for him. I think the girl was supposed to be in Ogallala by morning, and I think you know exactly what was waiting for her there. I think you walked in here expecting a waitress and some truckers, and instead you found 12 men who aren't going to let you leave with her." He paused. "So now the question is whether you're smart enough to leave without her." The room existed on a knife's edge. 12 bikers. 2 armed men. A teenager pressed against a wall. A trafficker bleeding on the floor. Snow bearing the world outside. The neon beer signs buzzing their idiot electric hymn above it all, bathing everything in that sick amber light. Dolan's gun hand shifted. Luca saw it. Every biker in the room saw it. And something happened then that would stay with Darla, the waitress, for the rest of her life. Something she'd described to the sheriff's deputies and later to the FBI, and even later to a journalist from the Denver Post. And every time she described it, her voice would shake. The bikers moved. Not all at once. Not in chaos. In sequence. Like a machine engaging. Dutch stepped forward from the kitchen hallway, cutting off the rear escape route. Possum moved to the left, blocking the window exit. Bishop and 2 others shifted to flank Dolan from the sides. Luca held the center. Graves held the front. Nobody drew a weapon. Nobody shouted. Nobody threatened. They just closed the space. 12 broken, scarred, exhausted men who smelled like engine oil and cigarettes and frozen highway, and who had nothing in the world except each other and the motorcycles outside. They simply stood up and made a wall between a girl and the men who had come to take her. Hale broke first. Not dramatically, not with a shout or a shot. He simply looked at Dolan, and in that look was an entire conversation. "The math doesn't work. There are too many of them. The sheriff is coming. This is over." Dolan's jaw worked. His gun hand trembled. Not with fear, but with the fury of a man who is used to controlling rooms and has just realized this one has slipped beyond his reach. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is for tonight," Graves replied. Dolan holstered his weapon. Hale did the same. They backed toward the door. Not turning, not breaking eye contact, moving in the careful retreat of men who understood that showing your back in this room was a potentially fatal mistake. The door opened, snow and cold poured in. Dolan stopped in the doorframe. "We'll be back with real backup. Warrants, a TF, state police. Every one of you will go down for tonight." "Looking forward to it," Luca said from the center of the room, blood still drying on his knuckles, his voice flat and ancient with contempt. Dolan and Hale disappeared into the storm. The door swung shut. For 5 seconds, nobody breathed. Then Graves turned to Dutch. "Follow them. Don't engage. I need to know what they're driving, what direction they go, and whether they make a phone call before they leave the lot." Dutch was gone before the sentence finished. Graves looked at the room. The truckers were still on the floor. Darla was still pressed against the wall. The cook had appeared in the kitchen window, wide-eyed, holding a spatula like a weapon. "It's over," Graves said to the civilians. "For now, stay inside. Storm's not safe." The truckers peeled themselves off the floor. One of them, the big one in the Peterbilt cap, looked at Graves with an expression caught between gratitude and terror. He opened his mouth, decided against whatever he was going to say, and returned to his stool. Darla picked up the pieces of the broken coffee pot with shaking hands. "I should have said something earlier," she whispered. When I saw the girl, I should have. You didn't, Graves said. Not cruelly, not gently, just factually. Make more coffee. He walked to the back of the diner where Ivy Mercer sat in bishop's leather cut with her back against the wall and her knees pulled to her chest. She looked like a small animal that had been cornered so many times it no longer believed corners were temporary. Graves lowered himself to one knee, keeping 3 feet of distance between them. His scarred hands rested on his thighs. His eyes met hers at her level. Not above, not beside, but exactly at her level. They're gone, he said. Ivy didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the door. They might come back, probably not tonight. The storm's too bad and they know the sheriff's coming, but they might come back. So I'm going to ask you something, and you don't have to answer, but it'll help if you do. She blinked, looked at him. Up close, she could see the scar tissue on his hands, the way his left ring finger was slightly crooked from an old break that hadn't set right, the exhaustion behind his eyes that had nothing to do with tonight and everything to do with the last 16 years. How many of them are there? Graves asked. Ivy's mouth opened, closed, her throat worked. She'd spent 3 days in forced silence, and the muscles of speech felt foreign, like trying to use a limb that had fallen asleep. I don't know, she finally said. Her voice was barely there, a ghost of a voice. Curtis made calls, different people each time, different area codes. He had a list on his phone, pickup points, dates, first names only. How many names? I saw maybe 8, maybe more. He scrolled fast. Graves nodded slowly. Processing. 8 names meant 8 operators minimum. A network, routes, infrastructure. This wasn't a lone predator with a van. This was an organization. The 2 who just left, he said. You recognized one of them. It wasn't a question. He'd seen her face when they walked in. He'd seen the ice hit her bloodstream, the recognition, the collapse. The tall one, Ivy whispered. Hale. He was in a photo on Curtis's phone. They were standing together, smiling, like friends. Where was the photo taken? Parking garage. Underground, maybe. Gray walls. There was a van behind them, white. No markings. Graves filed it, every detail. He had a memory built for debriefs, the kind the Marine Corps had trained into him with mission reports and after-action reviews until the habit became permanent, until he cataloged information automatically, the way other people blinked. You're doing good, he said. Ivy's face crumpled for half a second, just half, before she pulled it back together with the kind of practice control that no 16-year-old should possess. No one believed me, she said. At the bus station, at the motel, no one even asked. Graves didn't offer comfort, didn't say he was sorry, didn't tell her it was going to be okay because he'd stopped telling people things would be okay in a country on the other side of the world when he realized that the people who said it were either lying or dead. People don't ask, he said. That's not about you. That's about them. Behind him, Luca was crouching beside Curtis Phelps. The trafficker hadn't moved from the floor. His nose was still bleeding. His zip-tied hands had turned purple at the fingertips. He stared at the ceiling with the flat, lizard-eyed patience of a man who had been arrested before and knew that silence was the only tool that still worked. Luca wanted to hit him again. The desire was physical, a voltage running through his arms, into his fists, crackling behind his eyes like heat lightning. Every time he looked at Curtis, he saw someone else. A truck stop in Amarillo. A 17-year-old girl with dark eyes and a laugh that filled rooms. A drainage canal in El Paso. A phone call at 3 a.m. that ended his old life and started this one. His sister, Marisol. Nobody caught. Nobody charged. Nobody even remembering her name now, except Luca and his mother, who lit a candle every night in a small apartment in Pueblo that Luca hadn't visited in 2 years because the sight of that candle made him want to burn the world to the ground. He stood up, walked away from Curtis, walked to the counter and braced both hands flat on the formica and leaned forward until his forehead nearly touched the surface, breathing in slow, deliberate counts the way a counselor in Cannon City had taught him. 4 in, 7 hold, 8 out. It didn't work. It never worked. But the act of trying kept his hands from doing something else. Possum appeared beside him. The older biker set a mug of fresh coffee on the counter without a word, and leaned against the adjacent stool, his bad legs stretched out, his graying ponytail dripping snowmelt onto his collar. "You good?" Possum asked. "No. Didn't think so." Silence. The coffee steamed between them. The jukebox had run out of songs and was cycling through static. "Those two are coming back," Luca said. "Probably." "Not with warrants, with more men. This isn't a badge problem, Possum. This is a network. They've got infrastructure, routes, multiple vehicles. They had a handoff point in Ogallala. That means someone's waiting in Ogallala right now." Possum sipped his coffee. Graves knows. Graves is being careful. Graves is being smart. Smart doesn't keep that girl alive if they come back with 6 guys and real weapons instead of fake badges. Possum turned to look at Luca directly. His eyes were pale blue, faded from decades of sun and wind and the low-grade alcohol poisoning of a man who'd been drinking steadily since Vietnam and hadn't quite managed to finish the job. But behind the fade was something hard, old steel under rust. "You remember what happened last time you stopped being careful?" Possum asked quietly. Luca's jaw clenched. 4 years in Cannon City," Possum continued. "And the man you beat? He survived. Got a restraining order, moved to another state, started again with a different woman. Your sister didn't come back because you couldn't keep your hands down, Luca, and that girl over there won't stay safe because you lose your head tonight." The words landed like a slap, accurate, brutal, the kind of truth that only someone who loved you would deliver and only someone who respected you would expect you to hear. Luca stared at his coffee. His jaw worked. A muscle in his neck jumped 3 times in rapid succession. "I hear you," he said. "Do you?" "I said I hear you." Possum nodded and said nothing more. At the front of the diner, Dutch came back in from the storm. Snow was caked in his beard and across his shoulders. He walked straight to Graves and bent close. "Gray sedan, Colorado plates, rental sticker on the bumper. They headed east on 40. Hale made a call before they pulled out. Short, 30 seconds, maybe 45. Then they drove fast, faster than the storm should allow. East toward Craig? Or the interstate?" Graves processed this. East meant they were either running or regrouping. The phone call meant someone else knew what had happened. The speed meant urgency. Every piece of data pointed in the same direction. The clock was ticking. He looked at the window. The storm was still raging, but the heaviest bands had shifted north. In an hour, maybe 2, the highway would become passable. The sheriff would arrive. And after the sheriff, whoever Dolan and Hale called would arrive too. "How's the girl?" Dutch asked. "Scared, coherent. She's got information. Names, phone numbers, pickup points. If the network knows she's been recovered, they'll be burning routes and aliases right now. Everything on Curtis's phone has a shelf life measured in hours. His phone's still in the truck." "I know." The 2 men looked at each other. The unspoken question hung between them like smoke. Graves shook his head. "We don't touch it. Chain of evidence. The sheriff needs to process that vehicle and everything in it by the book, or every name on that phone walks on a technicality. And if the network wipes it remotely before the sheriff gets here?" Graves didn't answer. Because the answer was a problem he didn't have a solution for, and he'd learned in Hellman that speaking unsolvable problems aloud didn't solve them. It just spread the weight to men who were already carrying too much. He walked back to Ivy. She hadn't moved from her spot against the wall. Bishop was sitting in a booth 4 feet away, not speaking to her, not looking at her, just being there. A quiet, trembling old man who understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone was simply not leave the room. "Ivy," Graves said, "the sheriff's coming. When he gets here, he's going to ask you a lot of questions. You're going to be tired and scared, and you're going to want to stop talking. But everything you can remember, every name, every number, every place, every face, could be the difference between those men disappearing forever and those men being found." Ivy looked at him. Something was building behind her eyes. Not tears, not anger, but a kind of cold clarity that Graves recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors and in the faces of young Marines who'd survived their first ambush and come out the other side altered at a molecular level. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said. Graves waited. "Curtis's phone. When he made the call about Ogallala, the person on the other end, he called them by a name. What name? Harlan. The word dropped into the diner like a stone into deep water. Graves' face didn't change, but behind his concrete eyes, something cracked. A hairline fracture running through 16 years of composure, through scar tissue and silence, and the careful architecture of a man who had rebuilt himself from rubble. Luca saw it from the counter. He'd never seen that expression on Graves' face. Not in bar fights, not in hospital waiting rooms, not in the middle of a thunderstorm outside Cheyenne when a semi nearly killed 3 of them on a blind curve. "Graves?" Luca said. Graves didn't respond. He was staring at the girl but not seeing her, seeing something else, something old and buried and seismic. "Graves," Luca said again, louder. "What is it?" Graves blinked, came back. The fracture sealed itself. Not healed, just sealed, the way you seal a wound in the field to keep functioning until you can afford to bleed. "I know that name," he said quietly. Every biker in the room turned. Harlan Poe. We served in the same unit. Helmand, 2008 to 2010. He was intelligence, logistics coordinator, handled asset transfers between forward operating bases. The silence in the diner was absolute. Even the storm outside seemed to pause. After discharge, he went private sector, defense contracting. Then he dropped off the map entirely. No address, no employment record, no tax filings. I tried to find him once, 3 years ago, because his name came up in connection with a missing person case in Wyoming. A girl, 15. Vanished from a rest stop near Casper. Luca's hands went flat on the counter again, his knuckles white. "They never found her," Graves said. "They never found him either." Ivy sat against the wall, wrapped in a dead man's leather cut, watching the scarred biker process information that was rearranging everything he thought he understood about tonight. "He was smart," Graves continued, almost to himself now, his voice dropping to the frequency of a man sorting through wreckage. "Methodical. He ran logistics like a campaign, supply chains, route optimization, timing. In the field, we called it efficiency. Out here," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. A man trained by the United States military in logistics, intelligence, and asset movement, now applying those exact skills to trafficking human beings across state lines. The routes wouldn't be random. The operators wouldn't be amateurs. The network would be structured like a military operation because it was designed by someone who thought in military terms. And that man now knew his Colorado route had been compromised. Dutch spoke from beside the counter. "If Poe is running this, he's already burning the Ogallala connection, rotating pickup points, reassigning operators. Everything on Curtis's phone is going dark in real time." "I know," Graves said. "Then we need that phone." "I said we don't touch it. And I said the network wipes it remotely. Every girl on every route Poe is running right now stays gone. Forever. That phone is the only copy of the playbook. Graves. The sheriff gets here in 20 minutes. Poe's people can remote wipe a phone in 30 seconds. The diner felt like a compression chamber. Every person in the room understood the stakes. The phone in Curtis's truck contained evidence that could dismantle a multi-state trafficking network. But touching it could contaminate the chain of custody and give defense attorneys exactly the opening they needed to suppress everything on it. Leave it and risk losing everything. Touch it and risk the same thing. Graves closed his eyes. Behind the lids, he saw Helmand, the collapsed building, the 2 dead Marines, the radio that didn't work, 3 days of digging through rubble with his bare hands, making impossible choices between moving a beam that might bring down the ceiling or staying still and dying slowly. He opened his eyes. "Possum, you still carry that Polaroid?" The old biker blinked. "In my saddlebag." "Wait, get it. Photograph every screen of that phone without touching it. Don't unlock it. Just photograph whatever's visible on the display. If there are notifications, missed calls, text previews, anything visible without entering a passcode, I want a picture of it. Don't move the phone. Don't pick it up. Just shoot the screen through the truck window." Possum was already moving toward the door. "And Possum." The old biker stopped. "Wear gloves. Don't touch the door handle. Don't touch anything. We need to give the sheriff a vehicle exactly the way we found it." Possum disappeared into the blizzard. Graves turned back to Ivy. The girl was watching him with an expression that had shifted again. No longer just fear, no longer just exhaustion, but something sharper. Recognition. The recognition of a person watching someone solve a problem that everyone else had either ignored or made worse. "You know him," Ivy said. "The man running this. You know him." "I did. A long time ago." "Is he dangerous?" Graves looked at her, at the bruises on her wrists, at the split lip, at the shadows under her eyes that would take weeks to fade, and the shadows behind her eyes that might never fade at all. "Yes," he said. No softening, no qualification. She deserved the truth, and the truth was that the man running the network that had stolen her life for 3 days was someone Graves had once trusted enough to sleep beside in a combat zone. Someone trained in exactly the skills needed to build what he'd apparently built. Someone who wouldn't stop because a snowstorm diner full of bikers had disrupted one route on one night. Ivy absorbed this. Her jaw set. Something realigned behind her eyes, fear compressing into something denser, something with edges. "Then you have to stop him," she said. "That's not what we do." "You stopped Curtis. Curtis was in this room. Poe isn't. But you know him. You know how he thinks. You know, I know what he was. I don't know what he is now. And hunting a man across multiple states isn't something a motorcycle club does, Ivy. That's law enforcement, FBI, federal task force work." Federal. She almost laughed. The sound was small and broken and devastating. "The last 2 men who walked in here with federal badges were here to take me back to him." Graves had no answer for that. Because she was right. The system that was supposed to protect her had been infiltrated by the people she needed protection from. The badges were fake, but the power they represented was real. The power to walk into a room and command obedience, to claim authority over a child's body with a piece of laminated cardstock and a confident voice. And it worked. It almost worked tonight. Luca appeared beside Graves. He'd been listening from the counter. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were lit with something that looked like purpose. The dangerous kind. The kind that had sent him to Cannon City once and might send him somewhere worse. "She's not wrong," Luca said. "Don't. I'm not saying we ride out tonight and start hunting. I'm saying the sheriff gets here, takes Curtis, takes the phone, files reports. And then what? FBI opens a case? That takes weeks, months. Poe rebuilds his network in that time. Every girl on every route. I know what happens, Luca." "Then what are we doing?" Graves looked at him, looked at the bikers standing around the diner like sentinels in a room that smelled like burned coffee and gunpowder, looked at Ivy, looked at the floor where Curtis Phelps lay breathing through a broken nose. "We're waiting for the sheriff," Graves said, "and then we're making a decision I'm not ready to make yet." Headlights swept across the diner's front window, red and blue, flickering through the snow. Routt County Sheriff's Department. 3 vehicles. Moving slow through the storm, their sirens muffled by wind and distance. Graves straightened, looked at his club. "Everything by the book from here. Let them process the scene. Let them take custody of the suspect. Answer questions, be cooperative. Don't volunteer information about Dolan and Hale until I talk to whoever's in charge." "Why not?" Luca demanded. "Because if Poe has people carrying fake federal badges, we don't know who else he has. We don't know which agencies are compromised. We don't know if the sheriff walking through that door in the next 60 seconds is clean." The words landed like ice water. Every biker in the room felt it. The sudden, vertiginous understanding that the ground beneath them had shifted. This wasn't a roadside rescue anymore. This wasn't a trafficker caught in a snowstorm and a girl saved by luck and proximity. This was something with roots, something with reach, something that had burrowed into the institutions designed to prevent exactly what it was doing. And 12 men on motorcycles in a dying diner in northern Colorado were standing at the edge of it with nothing but leather cuts and bad histories and the fragile, terrifying weight of a 16-year-old girl's survival. The cruiser doors opened outside. Flashlight beams cut through the blizzard. Graves looked at Ivy one more time. "Whatever happens in the next hour," he said, "you stay near Bishop. You don't leave this room. And if anyone tries to take you out of this diner before I say it's clear, you scream, loud as you can. Don't stop until I get to you." Ivy nodded. The front door opened. Sheriff's deputies filed in, weapons drawn, voices barking commands that overlapped and echoed in the small space. Flashlight beams swept across the bikers, the blood on the floor, the hole in the ceiling, the girl in the oversized leather cut pressed against the back wall. Leading them was a deputy in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a command voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. She took one look at the scene, the zip-tied man, the shattered glasses, the bikers, the girl, and her eyes narrowed with the professional suspicion of someone who had walked into too many situations that were simpler than they looked. "Who's in charge here?" she demanded. Graves stepped forward, and behind him, unseen by anyone, noticed by no one in the controlled chaos of a law enforcement arrival, Curtis Phelps smiled. A small smile. Brief. Directed at no one. The smile of a man who had just watched 3 sheriff's deputies walk into a diner and recognized one of them. The deputy's name was Cortez. She was 37 years old, lean and precise, with dark hair pulled into a regulation bun and a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete since birth. She carried herself the way every competent rural law enforcement officer carried themselves, with the quiet authority of someone who had been understaffed, underfunded, and underestimated for their entire career and had learned to compensate through sheer relentless competence. She swept the diner with trained eyes. Blood on the floor, hole in the ceiling, zip-tied suspect, 12 bikers, 1 teenage girl in an oversized leather cut. She processed the scene in under 5 seconds and started issuing orders. "Ramirez, secure the suspect. Get EMS on the line. He needs his face looked at before transport. Coulter, start taking statements from the civilians. Nobody leaves until I've talked to them." The 2 deputies behind her moved. "Ramirez," a young man with a buzz cut and the careful movements of someone freshly out of the academy, crouched beside Curtis Phelps and began checking vitals. Coulter, older, heavy-set, with the resigned expression of a man counting down to his pension, pulled out a notepad and approached the truckers at the counter. Cortez walked straight to Graves. Up close, the contrast between them was almost theatrical. The deputy in her crisp uniform, her badge reflecting the neon light, her weapon holstered with the retention strap snapped, and the biker in his scarred leather cut, his beard threaded with silver, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug like he was holding the last warm thing in Colorado. "Name," she said. "Rhett Callahan. I'm the one who called." "You restrained the suspect?" "I did." Weapon was discharged. Luca Knox disarmed him when he drew on the room, 1 round into the ceiling. The weapon is under the jukebox. Nobody else fired. Cortez's eyes moved to Luca, who stood near the counter with his arms crossed, and the coiled tension of a man keeping himself on a leash by willpower alone. She noted the blood on his knuckles, filed it. "And the girl?" Graves turned slightly, giving Cortez a line of sight to Ivy, who sat in the back booth with Bishop beside her. "Ivy Mercer, 16. She slipped me a note saying the man wasn't her family. He was transporting her using forged federal credentials. She says she was taken from a Greyhound station in Grand Junction 3 days ago." Cortez absorbed this without visible reaction, but something changed behind her eyes. A door opening, a priority shifting. "Has she been examined?" "No, nobody's touched her." "Good. Keep it that way." Cortez looked back at Curtis on the floor. "I'm going to need his vehicle secured." "Where is it?" "Gray Dodge Ram, Nebraska plates, parked in the lot. Engine was running when we checked. My guys shut it off. There are burner phones in the center console, a GPS unit on the dash, and..." Graves paused. "Industrial zip ties in the glove box." Cortez's expression didn't change, but her hand moved to her radio and keyed the mic. "Dispatch, Cortez, I need a crime scene unit at Merle's Diner off Route 40. Possible trafficking in persons. Suspect in custody. Minor recovered. Requesting FBI coordination and state patrol assistance on surrounding highways." The radio crackled. Static. The storm was eating signals. She tried again. More static. A fragment of a voice. Garbled. Lost. "Comms are down," she muttered. "Storm's killing the repeater. Ramirez, you getting anything on your cell?" "No signal, ma'am." Cortez looked at the ceiling like she was calculating. "All right. We process what we can, transport the suspect when the road clears, and get a real forensics team out here at first light." She turned back to Graves. "Anything else I need to know right now?" This was the moment. Graves had spent the last 20 minutes deciding what to say and what to hold. The two fake federal agents, Dolan and Hale, who had walked in, demanded the girl and left when they couldn't take her. The name Harlan Poe. The connection to a military intelligence operative running a multi-state trafficking network. The fact that the network had people carrying fabricated law enforcement credentials, which meant it had penetrated, or at least convincingly mimicked, the very institutions now standing in this diner. He looked at Cortez, studied her, searched for the telltale signs, the too casual glance at Curtis, the micro-expression of recognition, the subtle body language that would indicate she was anything other than what she appeared to be. He found nothing. Cortez read clean, professional, impatient, the kind of deputy who had too many cases and not enough resources and had long ago replaced optimism with procedure. But the last line of part 2 echoed in his memory. Curtis Phelps, smiling on the floor, smiling at nothing. Unless it wasn't nothing. Unless it was someone. 2 men came in before you, Graves said, claimed to be U.S. Marshals, Dolan and Hale. They had badges, demanded custody of the girl. One of my guys clocked them leaving in a gray sedan, Colorado rental plates heading east on 40. Cortez stiffened. Federal agents were here? That's what they said. And you didn't release the girl to them? Their credentials didn't sit right, and they had no transport vehicle visible in the lot. 2 men claiming protective custody of a minor in a severe storm with no support unit, no communications protocol, and no vehicle consistent with a federal operation. Cortez stared at him. You clocked all that. I was a Marine. Observation's a habit I never kicked. And you think they were part of it? The girl recognized one of them from a photograph on the suspect's phone. Cortez turned to look at Ivy across the diner. The girl was watching them, watching everything, with the hypervigilant stillness of someone whose survival had depended on reading rooms for 3 days. I'll need a full statement from her, Cortez said, and from you, and from every one of your guys. You'll get it. But deputy, the suspect's phone is in his truck. That phone has names, routes, contacts. If anyone in that network knows he's been caught, they'll wipe it remotely. If your comms are down, that buys time, but not much. You want me to pull the phone? I want you to make that call. It's your scene. Cortez studied him again, longer this time, reading him the way he'd been reading her, looking for the angle, the agenda, the hidden play. Stay here, she said. She walked toward the front door, pulling on gloves. Ramirez looked up from Curtis. Ma'am? I'm securing the suspect's vehicle. Nobody touches anything until I'm back. Coulter, keep working statements. She pushed through the door into the storm. Cold air flooded the diner for 3 seconds before the door swung shut. Graves watched her go. Then he looked at Curtis Phelps. The trafficker was lying on his side now, Ramirez having repositioned him for the medical check. His broken nose had been packed with gauze from the deputy's first aid kit. His eyes were open, alert, and they were tracking the third deputy, Coulter, with an attention that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with focus. Graves saw it. The way Curtis's eyes followed Coulter as the heavy-set deputy moved from trucker to trucker, not the darting, anxious gaze of a man in custody surrounded by enemies. Something steadier, something almost expectant, the way a man watches an ally in a room full of strangers waiting for a signal. Graves' blood went cold. He looked at Coulter, really looked. The deputy was mid-50s, thick through the middle, with the ruddy complexion of a man who spent too many nights in bars and not enough mornings at the gym. He'd been with the department long enough to develop the lazy competence of a career time server, asking the right questions, writing in his notepad, performing the choreography of police work without any of the underlying urgency. But there was something else, something Graves almost missed because it was so small. Coulter hadn't looked at Ivy. Not once. Every other person who'd walked into this diner, the bikers, Darla, the truckers, Cortez, Ramirez, had looked at the girl immediately. A natural human response, a child wrapped in a biker's jacket, clearly distressed, at the center of a crime scene. The eye goes there first. Every time. Coulter's eye had gone everywhere else. The counter, the truckers, the ceiling, the jukebox. Curtis on the floor. A glance, brief, professional. The bikers. Cataloged, and dismissed. The broken coffee pot on the floor, the cash register, never the girl. As if looking at her would create a connection he was trying to avoid. Graves set his coffee down. He leaned forward in the booth, placing his elbows on the table, and spoke quietly to Luca without turning his head. "Third Deputy, Coulter. What do you see?" Luca had been standing at the counter with his arms crossed. He shifted his weight slightly, using the motion to sweep his gaze across the room. Coulter was 3 stools away, writing in his notepad, asking a trucker what time he'd arrived. "He's going through the motions," Luca said. "What else?" Luca watched for another 10 seconds. Coulter finished with the trucker and moved toward Darla. He asked her the same standard questions. "When did you start your shift? When did the suspect arrive? Did you notice anything unusual?" Darla answered in a shaking voice. Coulter wrote without looking up. "He's not asking about the girl," Luca said slowly. "Every question is about the scene, the diner, the timeline. Nothing about the victim." "Keep watching." Luca watched, and then he saw it. The thing Graves had already seen. The thing that changed everything. Coulter finished with Darla and turned toward the back of the diner. His path should have taken him to Bishop and Ivy, the next logical witnesses. Instead, he veered left, toward Curtis. He crouched beside the trafficker. Ramirez was 3 feet away, organizing medical supplies. Coulter leaned close to Curtis, ostensibly to check the zip ties or ask a standard booking question. But his lips moved. 3 words, maybe 4. Too quiet for anyone across the room to hear. Curtis's body changed. The tension in his shoulders released, his breathing steadied, and his eyes, those flat reptilian eyes, blinked once in what looked unmistakably like acknowledgement. Luca's entire body went rigid. "Graves. I saw it. He's one of them. I know. Inside the sheriff's department. They've got someone inside the sheriff's. I know." The diner suddenly felt like a trap. The walls closer, the ceiling lower, the exits fewer. 12 bikers, 1 corrupted deputy, 1 young deputy who might or might not be clean, 1 lead deputy outside in the storm, 1 trafficker on the floor, and 1 16-year-old girl who was the only witness to a network that had apparently burrowed deep enough into local law enforcement to have a man wearing a badge in the room. Graves's mind ran the scenarios. If Coulter was compromised, Cortez might not know. Or Cortez might know and be part of it. Or Cortez might be clean, but Ramirez might not. The permutations multiplied like cracks in glass, and every calculation led to the same conclusion. They could not trust anyone in uniform until they knew for certain who was owned and who wasn't. He stood from the booth and walked to Bishop. "Take Ivy to the kitchen," he said quietly. "Stay with her. Lock the back door. Don't open it for anyone unless it's me or Luca. If you hear shooting, take her out through the service exit and get her to the bikes." Bishop looked up at him. The old man's hands were trembling. They always trembled, but his eyes were clear. He'd ridden with Graves for 9 years. He'd seen things in those years that would make most people lose sleep permanently. He didn't ask questions. "Come on, sweetheart," Bishop said to Ivy, standing slowly. "Let's get you somewhere quieter." Ivy looked at Graves. The clarity in her eyes was sharper now, almost painful. She understood, maybe not the specifics, but the frequency, the shift, the way the bikers had suddenly gone tighter, harder, more electric. "Something's wrong," she said. "We're being careful. Go with Bishop." She went. Bishop walked her through the swinging kitchen door, and it closed behind them with a sound that shouldn't have felt as final as it did. Graves turned to find Luca already at his shoulder. "What's the play?" Luca asked. "We need to isolate Coulter without tipping him. If he knows we've made him, he calls it in. Radio's down, but if he's got a personal cell or a burner, he's a small-town deputy making $40,000 a year driving a county cruiser. If Poe's network is paying him, it's not for his tactical skills. It's for access, information, advance warning. Which means he's already provided it. He knew Cortez was bringing him on this call. He knew the route. He knows the diner. And he's going to know the transport plan for Curtis." Luca's jaw worked. If Curtis gets transported through normal channels and Coulter feeds the route to the network, they intercept before the suspect ever reaches a federal holding facility. Curtis disappears. Evidence disappears. Ivy's testimony becomes a girl's word against a ghost. Worse than that, if they know Ivy can identify operators, she becomes a target. The word target settled between them like a lead weight. Possum returned from outside. Snow was caked in his eyebrows and across the front of his cut. He moved straight to Graves with the deliberate urgency of a man carrying bad news. "Got your pictures," he said, producing a handful of Polaroids. Phone screen was visible through the truck window. Lock screen notifications. 6 missed calls from 3 different numbers. Area codes spread across 3 states. And there was a text preview visible without unlocking. He handed the Polaroid to Graves. Graves tilted it toward the neon light. The image was grainy, shot through a frost-covered truck window, but the text preview was legible. "Canary is singing. Move to secondary. Burn Ogallala." The timestamp on the text was 11 minutes ago. Someone in the network already knew. Already knew Curtis was compromised. Already knew the Ogallala handoff point was blown. 11 minutes ago, while Cortez was still processing the scene, while the storm was still burying the highway, someone had sent the order to abandon the route. But the phone had no signal. The storm had killed communications, which meant the text had been sent but not necessarily received. It was sitting in a server somewhere, waiting for the signal to return to push through. Or it meant someone in this building had a way to communicate that didn't depend on cell towers. Graves looked at Coulter. The deputy was standing near the register now, writing in his notepad. His posture was relaxed, casual. He looked exactly like a bored small-town cop doing paperwork at a scene that was above his pay grade. His left hand was in his jacket pocket. Graves had seen men use satellite phones in combat zones, compact ones, the kind that fit in a jacket pocket and worked regardless of weather, terrain, or cell coverage. They were expensive, $2,000 minimum, far beyond the budget of a county deputy, but well within the budget of a network moving human cargo across state lines. "Possum," Graves said. "When you were in the lot, did you see Coulter near his cruiser at any point?" Possum thought. "Yeah, he went back to it right after they arrived. Said he was getting a flashlight. Took about a minute." "Long enough to make a call?" "Long enough to make 2. Graves felt the architecture of the situation shift beneath him like tectonic plates. The text on Curtis's phone, "Canary is singing," had been sent 11 minutes ago. Coulter had gone to his cruiser approximately 14 minutes ago. The timeline worked. Coulter was the conduit. He'd walked into the diner, assessed the scene, walked back to his cruiser, and made a call on whatever device the network had given him. That call had triggered the burn order. Ogallala was already going dark. Routes were being abandoned. Operators were scattering, and Coulter was standing 15 feet from them, writing in a notepad, waiting. Waiting for what? The answer hit Graves like a mortar round. Coulter wasn't just a leak. He was a logistics piece. If Harlan Poe ran his network like a military operation, and everything suggested he did, then Coulter wasn't just feeding information. He was facilitating. He was the inside man who would ensure the suspect was transported along a specific route at a specific time, creating a window for extraction. Or, if the suspect couldn't be extracted, ensuring the witness could be accessed. Curtis Phelps didn't need a lawyer. He needed Coulter to get him 5 minutes alone with a phone, or 5 minutes in a transport vehicle that would take an unscheduled detour. And Ivy didn't need protection from the men outside. She needed protection from the man wearing a badge 10 feet from the coffee machine. Graves had to move. Now. He walked to Cortez the moment she came back through the front door with Curtis's phone sealed in an evidence bag, her gloves covered in snow, her face tight with the cold, and something else. Something she'd found in the truck. "More than burner phones," she said before Graves could speak. "There's a laptop under the passenger seat. Encrypted. I can see the login screen. And a folder. Manila. Photographs." She stopped. Her jaw worked. "Photographs of girls," she said. "Different girls. Different locations. Some of them look young." The diner seemed to contract around the words. Graves let the silence hold for 2 seconds. Then he spoke, keeping his voice low enough that only Cortez could hear. "We have a problem inside this room." Cortez's eyes sharpened. "Meaning what?" "Your third deputy, Coulter. He's been communicating with the trafficking network." Cortez went very still. Not the stillness of shock, The stillness of a woman evaluating whether the man in front of her was paranoid, dangerous, or telling the truth. That's a hell of an accusation. He hasn't looked at the victim once. He's asked every witness about the scene, but not one question about the girl. He leaned into the suspect and whispered something. I watched him do it. And he went back to his cruiser alone for a full minute right after arrival, which is when a burn order was sent to the suspect's phone from a number not associated with any known contact. He showed her the Polaroid, the text on the screen. Canary is singing. Move to secondary. Burn Ogallala. Cortez looked at the photograph for a long time. Her face was unreadable. The muscles in her jaw bunched and released in a slow rhythm. I've worked with Coulter for 8 years, she said. I served with Harlan Poe for 2. People become things you don't expect. Cortez looked across the diner at Coulter. The heavy-set deputy was pouring himself a coffee, his notepad tucked under his arm, looking for all the world like a man who'd rather be home in bed than standing in a diner at 1 a.m. during a blizzard. If you're wrong, Cortez said, I just destroyed a colleague's career on the word of a biker I've known for 20 minutes. If I'm right, that colleague is the reason girls in a manila folder under a truck seat never made it home. The sentence hung between them like a blade. Cortez exhaled through her nose, slow, controlled, a decision being made in real time, behind eyes that had already seen too much and were now being asked to see more. Ramirez, she called. Come here. The young deputy approached. Cortez leaned close and spoke into his ear. Ramirez's eyes widened. He looked at Coulter, then back at Cortez, then nodded once. What happened next took less than 40 seconds. Ramirez walked to Coulter and asked him to help secure something in the trunk of his cruiser. A routine request, delivered casually. Coulter set down his coffee, tucked his notepad into his belt, and followed Ramirez toward the front door. The moment they stepped outside, Cortez moved. She crossed the diner in 6 strides, positioned herself at the door, and drew her weapon. When Coulter turned around, already outside, already sensing that the tone of Ramirez's request had shifted, he found himself facing 2 drawn weapons and the kind of silence that only exists when someone has been caught and everyone in the radius knows it. Hands out of your pockets, Cortez said. Slowly. Coulter's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Confusion, calculation, and then something flat and cold that erased the bumbling small-town deputy like a mask being peeled off. Sarah, what the hell? Left pocket, whatever's in it. Take it out slowly and put it on the ground. Coulter stood in the snow with his hands half raised and the storm whipping around him. His eyes moved from Cortez to Ramirez to the diner window where 12 bikers watched like gargoyles. This is insane. I'm your deputy. We've worked 8 years, I know. Left pocket. Now. His hand moved, slowly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a device. Compact, black, with a stubby antenna. A satellite communicator. The kind of device a county deputy making $40,000 a year did not own, could not afford, and had no operational reason to carry. Cortez looked at the device, then at Coulter. The mask fell away completely. What was underneath wasn't rage or defiance, it was resignation. The exhausted, hollow look of a man who had known this moment was coming for years and had simply been waiting to see which night it arrived. How long? Cortez asked. Coulter said nothing. How long, Mike? 4 years. His voice was quiet, stripped. They approached me after Debbie's surgery. You know what her medical bills were. You know what we make. So you sold routes. I gave them transport schedules, patrol gaps, shift rotations. He stopped, swallowed. I never touched anyone. I never saw anyone. I just gave them windows. Windows for what? Coulter looked at the snow gathering on his boots. The storm was dying now. The heavy bands passing, the wind easing, the sky still dark but less violent. In another hour, the highway would open. In another 2, the sun would rise. You know what? He said. Cortez's weapon didn't waver. But something in her face broke. A fracture running through 8 years of shared cruiser rides and Christmas parties, and the slow, unremarkable trust of colleagues who depended on each other in small ways every day. The kind of trust that, once broken, doesn't just disappear. It retroactively poisons every memory it ever touched. Ramirez, cuff him. Get him in the back of my unit. Separate from the suspect. Ramirez moved. Handcuffs clicked in the cold air. Coulter went without resistance, his head down, his shoulders sagging under a weight that had nothing to do with the metal on his wrists. Inside the diner, Graves watched through the window. Luca stood beside him. Feel better? Luca asked. No. One deputy compromised means we don't know how many others. I know. Poe built this like a military operation. Redundancies, cutouts. If Coulter was his man in Routt County, he's got men in other counties, other departments, maybe state level. Graves didn't respond. He was thinking about the manila folder under the truck seat. Photographs of girls. Different locations, which meant different routes, different states. A network that extended far beyond one highway in Colorado, serviced by corrupted law enforcement officers in multiple jurisdictions, all answering to a man who had learned logistics in a war zone and applied it to the industrialized movement of children. The scale of it sat in his chest like a stone. Cortez came back inside. Her face was drawn. The confident authority she'd carried when she first walked in was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched over something raw and personal. Your read was right, she said to Graves. Satellite communicator. He admits to 4 years of feeding information to the network. Transport schedules, patrol gaps, shift changes. Did he give you names? He says he only communicated with one contact, a voice on the phone. No name. The voice? Man or woman? Man. Calm. Articulate. Military bearing in the way he spoke. Harlan Poe. Graves closed his eyes. Behind the lids, Hellman again. A forward operating base baking in 120-degree heat. Poe leaning over a logistics table, plotting vehicle routes with the focused precision of a chess player. Smiling when the math worked. Always smiling when the math worked. I need to make calls, Cortez said. Real calls. FBI field office in Denver. State Bureau of Investigation. But comms are still spotty, and I'm down a deputy. Use the diner's landline, Graves said, if it's working. Darla appeared from behind the counter like a ghost. Line's been dead since 10. Storm took out the poles on County Road 7. Cortez swore under her breath. She looked around the diner. At the bikers, the blood, the hole in the ceiling, the evidence bag with Curtis's phone, the Polaroid spread on the table. I can't process this alone, she said. Not to Graves specifically, to the room, to the situation. To the impossible mathematics of a single deputy with a compromised partner trying to manage a federal-level trafficking case in a diner cut off from the world by a dying blizzard. You're not alone, Graves said. You're civilians, bikers. You don't have jurisdiction, authority, or... We have 12 men, working vehicles, and the ability to keep that girl safe until you can reach someone with a bigger badge than yours. Which is all that matters right now. Cortez looked at him for a long moment. The calculation in her eyes was complex. Well, professional liability, personal trust, legal exposure, and the raw, unignorable reality that she was standing in a diner with a compromised colleague in her cruiser, a trafficker on her floor, a child in her kitchen, and a dead communication network. The girl doesn't leave my sight, Cortez said. Agreed. And your men don't touch the evidence. Any of it. Agreed. And when I get through to Denver, you explain everything you know about Harlan Poe to whoever picks up the phone. I will. Cortez nodded. It wasn't trust. It was triage. The kind of alliance that forms not because people believe in each other, but because the alternative is worse. Graves walked to the kitchen. Ivy was sitting on an overturned milk crate with Bishop's leather cut draped over her shoulders and a glass of water she hadn't touched on the prep table beside her. Bishop sat on a stool near the back door, his trembling hands wrapped around a mug of coffee the cook had silently prepared before retreating to the walk-in cooler to make phone calls that wouldn't connect. Ivy looked up when Graves entered. Her eyes were red but dry. She'd stopped crying sometime in the last hour and hadn't started again. The tears had been replaced by something harder, a kind of frozen awareness that Graves recognized from combat zones, from triage tents, from the faces of people who had processed so much trauma that their nervous system had simply switched to a different operating mode. One of the deputies was working for them, Ivy said. Not a question. Graves stopped walking. How did you know? The heavy one. He never looked at me. Everyone looks at me. The victim, the evidence, the thing in the middle of the room. He didn't look because looking would have made it personal, and he needed it to stay professional. She was 16 years old, and she was reading rooms like a 30-year veteran. Graves sat down on a crate across from her. The kitchen was cold. The back door leaked air, and the heating system was fighting a losing battle against the storm. And the fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh blue-white that made both of them look exhausted and ancient. He's been arrested, Graves said. He won't be involved in your case. My case? She almost laughed. Is that what this is? That's what it's going to become. When the FBI gets involved, and they will, they'll assign a case number and a victim advocate and a special agent, and it'll become paperwork. That's how the system works. The system had a man in a badge feeding my location to the people who took me. Graves had no argument against that. He sat with the silence and let it be true. What happens to me now? Ivy asked. Your mother's been contacted. The sheriff's department, Cortez, who's clean, is working on getting her here. The storm's breaking. In a few hours, the highway opens. Your mom comes. FBI comes. You give your statement. They build a case. And the man who runs it all? Harlan? Graves looked at her. At the bruises. At the split lip. At the girl who had survived 3 days in the hands of a monster and come out the other side with the clarity of a war correspondent. That's not your problem anymore. It's everyone's problem. If he built this like you said, like a military operation, then taking down one route doesn't stop him. He has other routes, other girls, right now, tonight. While we're sitting in this kitchen. She was right, and the weight of that rightness pressed down on Graves's shoulders like the rubble in Helmand, like the building that never stopped collapsing, like the radio that never started working. You asked me earlier if he was dangerous, Graves said. I told you yes, but I didn't tell you why. Ivy waited. In Helmand, there was an incident, classified. Poe was running logistics for a joint operation, moving assets, supplies, interpreters between bases. After 3 months, interpreters started disappearing. Young ones. The military called it attrition, enemy action. Nobody questioned the logistics coordinator because the logistics coordinator controlled the paperwork. Graves's voice had dropped so low it was barely audible above the hum of the kitchen freezer. I questioned it. I went to my CO. My CO went to intelligence. Intelligence told him it was handled. 2 weeks later, I found a manifest in Poe's quarters. Handwritten. Names, dates, locations. Not interpreters being moved between bases. Interpreters being moved off base entirely, to private contractors, for purposes that were never documented. The kitchen was silent. I reported it through channels, official channels. The report was filed, acknowledged, and buried. Poe was reassigned, not discharged, not arrested. Reassigned. Different base, different theater. And the interpreters who disappeared were listed as combat casualties in a database that nobody audited because auditing meant admitting the system had a hole. Ivy stared at him. The frozen awareness in her eyes was cracking, and what was coming through the cracks wasn't fear. It was fury. The white-hot, clarifying fury of a person who has just understood that the thing that happened to them is not an anomaly, but a pattern, a system, a machine that has been running for years, fed by indifference, and protected by the very institutions designed to stop it. You knew, she said. You knew what he was capable of, years ago. I reported it through the proper, and nothing happened. No. And now he's doing it here, on American highways, to American girls. And you ride your motorcycles and drink your coffee, and that's enough. Graves's voice was quiet, but it had an edge now. Not anger, but the sound of a man who has carried the same guilt she was trying to hand him and already knows its exact weight to the gram. I didn't stop him then because the machine was bigger than me, and it'll be bigger than me now. I'm not law enforcement. I'm not military anymore. I'm a man who rides a motorcycle and can't sleep through the night. That's what I am. Ivy's fury didn't fade, but it shifted, redirected. She looked at Graves the way a drowning person looks at someone standing on shore. Not with accusation, but with the desperate, impossible question, "Are you going to come in after me or not?" From the front of the diner, a sound. Engines, not Harleys, something heavier, multiple vehicles, growing louder. Luca appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face was white. "Graves, we've got a problem." Graves was on his feet instantly. He followed Luca to the front window and looked through the frost. 3 vehicles had pulled into the lot. Black SUVs, government plates. No markings. No light bars. The kind of vehicles that didn't belong to county sheriffs or state troopers or anyone who operated under the kind of oversight that required visible identification. 6 men got out. Dark jackets. No visible badges. They moved in pairs, covering each other, sweeping the lot with flashlights, checking the bikers' motorcycles, approaching the diner entrance with the coordinated discipline of a tactical team. Cortez stepped outside to meet them. A brief exchange, too far away to hear through the glass. Then Cortez turned and walked back inside. Her face had changed. The confident authority was gone, replaced by something Graves had seen only in soldiers who had just received orders they knew were wrong but couldn't refuse. "Federal Task Force," Cortez said. Her voice was flat, mechanical. "Out of Denver. They're assuming jurisdiction. They want the suspect, the evidence, and the girl. Immediate transfer. All of it." Graves looked at her. "And they have paperwork," Cortez added. "Real paperwork. Federal letterhead, judge's signature, transfer orders." In the middle of a blizzard, at 2 in the morning, 3 hours after the incident, they say the trafficking unit was already tracking the suspect and the storm delayed their response. "Do you believe that?" Cortez didn't answer, but her hand, the one at her side, away from the federal men outside, made a small, deliberate gesture. Her index finger extended and tapped her holster twice, the gesture a partner makes when they want you to know they're ready but can't say it out loud. Graves looked through the window at the 6 men in dark jackets approaching the diner door. Professional, equipped, coordinated. They could be exactly what they claimed, a legitimate federal task force arriving to assume jurisdiction over a trafficking case. Or they could be Harlan Poe's response to a compromised route. Better equipped, better credentialed, and infinitely more dangerous than Dolan and Hale. And Graves had approximately 15 seconds to decide which one before they walked through that door and took Ivy Mercer into the night. He looked at Luca. He looked at Dutch. He looked at Possum and Bishop and every scarred, exhausted, broken-down rider in the Lost Saints MC. 12 men against 6, maybe more. No weapons except fists and whatever was in their saddlebags. No authority, no badges, no legal standing whatsoever. Just the memory of a napkin with 4 smeared words and a girl's voice whispering, "Please." Graves stepped between the girl and the door, and for the first time in 16 years, the Marine inside him, the one he'd buried under miles and bourbon and engine noise, opened his eyes. The first man through the door was tall and clean-shaven, with the kind of face that existed specifically to be forgettable. Mid-40s, brown hair cut short, no distinguishing features. He wore a dark field jacket over a collared shirt, and his badge, clipped to a lanyard around his neck, caught the neon light and threw a small golden reflection across the ceiling. "Special Agent Warren, FBI Trafficking Task Force," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who had delivered this introduction 100 times and had calibrated every syllable for maximum authority and minimum friction. "We're assuming jurisdiction over this scene effective immediately." Behind him, 5 more men filed in. They spread across the diner entrance in a loose formation that looked casual but wasn't. Each man positioned with a sightline to a different section of the room, each standing with that particular weight distribution that told Graves they were armed beneath their jackets and trained to draw fast. Cortez stood near the register. Her badge was visible. Her weapon was holstered. Her face was the controlled blank of a professional being outranked in real time. Graves hadn't moved from his position between the kitchen door and the dining room. His boots were planted. His arms were at his sides. He looked like a man waiting for a bus except for his eyes, which were doing the kind of rapid multi-point assessment that the Marine Corps had drilled into him until it became as automatic as breathing. 6 men, all fit, all armed, 2 near the door, 2 flanking the counter, 2 moving toward the back. Formation suggested training, federal, military, or private security. Their jackets were identical. Same cut, same color, same lack of visible agency markings beyond the badges on lanyards. The badges looked real. The paperwork Cortez was now examining looked real. Everything looked real. And that was exactly what made Graves' stomach turn. Transfer orders signed by a federal judge in Denver, Warren said, handing a second document to Cortez. We've been tracking the suspect, Curtis Phelps, for 3 weeks as part of an ongoing multi-state investigation. This diner is now a federal crime scene. We need the suspect, all physical evidence, including electronics and the vehicle, and the minor witness for a formal debrief at our Denver field office. Cortez read the papers slowly. Her eyes moved line by line, and Graves watched her face for the micro-expressions. The flicker of doubt, the tightening around the mouth, the almost imperceptible narrowing of the eyes that would tell him whether the documents held up under scrutiny or whether she was seeing what he was seeing. She looked up. These are dated today. Correct. Issued when the operation went active. At 2 in the morning, during a severe storm, by a judge who signed federal transfer orders for a case that, as far as I can verify with zero communications, doesn't exist in any database I have access to right now. Warren smiled. It was a patient smile, condescending. Communications are down across the county, Deputy. You can verify everything when your systems come back online. In the meantime, we have jurisdiction and we have orders. The suspect and the witness need to be transferred tonight for their own safety. The network this man operates in has local law enforcement compromise. You've already discovered that yourself. He glanced toward the window, where Coulter sat handcuffed in the back of Cortez's cruiser. Exactly my point, Warren continued. You can't guarantee the security of this scene or the witness. We can. It was a brilliant play. Graves recognized it with the grudging respect of a man watching an enemy execute a flawless maneuver. Warren had taken the one fact that should have made everyone in the room more suspicious of outside intervention, the corruption of a local deputy, and weaponized it into the reason to accept that intervention. He was using the breach to justify a bigger breach. Cortez hesitated. Graves saw it, the slight shift in her weight, the almost movement toward handing the documents back, the beginning of compliance. She was exhausted. She was alone. She'd just arrested her own colleague, and now 6 federal agents with paperwork and weapons and the full projected authority of the United States government were telling her to hand over the reins. In her position, 99 deputies out of 100 would comply. Graves spoke before she could. No. The word fell into the diner like a cinder block dropped from a roof. Every head turned. Warren's smooth expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Not much, but enough for Graves to see the machinery behind it recalibrate. I'm sorry, Warren said. And you are? The man who stopped the suspect from taking the girl. The man who identified the compromised deputy. And the man who's telling you that witness doesn't leave this building until I see verification that doesn't come from a piece of paper anyone with a printer and a law degree can fabricate. Warren's smile thinned. You're a civilian. This is a federal operation. I'd advise you not to. 3 hours ago, 2 men walked into this diner with federal credentials and demanded the same girl. Those credentials were fake. Those men were part of the trafficking network. So you'll understand if I'm not enthusiastic about the third set of strangers tonight claiming federal authority and asking to take a 16-year-old girl into the dark. The diner went absolutely still. Warren stared at Graves. The smooth veneer held, but beneath it, something was working, recalculating, repositioning, adapting. The eyes of a man who had expected compliance and received a wall. Deputy Cortez, Warren said, turning away from Graves deliberately, dismissively. Your jurisdiction, your call. But I want it on record that any delay in transferring the witness puts her at continued risk from a network you've already proven you can't secure against. Cortez looked at Warren, looked at Graves, looked at the documents in her hands. I'm going to take 15 minutes to verify what I can, she said. The storm's breaking. I might get a cell signal on the ridge behind the gas station. Until I confirm your identity and these orders with my own department and the FBI field office, nobody goes anywhere. Warren's jaw tightened, almost imperceptible. Every minute of delay, Is my call. You said it yourself, my jurisdiction. She walked toward the front door with the documents, pulling out her cell phone. Ramirez followed her without being asked, positioning himself between Cortez and the federal men with the instinctive loyalty of a young deputy who trusted his superior more than the strangers in the room. The door closed behind them. The diner settled into a silence so thick Graves could hear the fluorescent light above the counter humming at 60 hertz. Warren turned back to the room. His gaze swept the bikers, all 12 of them now positioned in a loose arc between the kitchen and the dining area, not blocking anything, not threatening anyone, just present in the way that 12 large men in leather are always present when they decide to be. "Gentlemen," Warren said, "I appreciate what you did tonight, seriously. You protected a girl and stopped a predator. That takes courage. But this is a federal matter now, and the best thing you can do for that girl is let trained professionals handle it from here." Nobody responded. Warren waited 3 seconds for an answer that wasn't coming, then turned to confer with one of his men near the counter. They spoke in low voices, their heads close, their eyes continually scanning the room. Graves walked to Luca. "Kitchen, now!" They pushed through the swinging door. Bishop was standing against the back wall with his arms crossed. Ivy was on the milk crate, exactly where Graves had left her, wrapped in the leather cut, her knees drawn up, her eyes wide and alert. Dutch was there too, filling the kitchen doorway like a boulder. He'd positioned himself the moment the SUVs pulled in and hadn't moved since. "Talk to me," Graves said to Luca. 6 men, all armed, Sig Sauer P 3200s. I clocked the holster prints through their jackets. That's not standard FBI issue for a field task force. Bureau uses Glock 19 Ms. Graves looked at him. "You sure?" "My cellmate in Cannon City was ex-Bureau, talked about his service weapon like it was his firstborn. Glock 19M adopted 2016 standard issue across all field divisions. Those men are carrying SIGs. It was a small thing, a single data point. The kind of detail that could mean nothing. Agents sometimes carried personal weapons, especially on task force assignments, or could mean everything." "What else?" Graves asked. "Their boots. Identical. Danner Tachyon Tactical. 8-inch, black. Every one of them. Field agents don't dress uniform. They're not military. They'd have different footwear, different jackets, different personal gear. These guys look like a private security team that bought in bulk." Dutch spoke from the doorway. "The SUVs I checked through the window. Government plates, but the frames are aftermarket, tinted beyond federal standard. And the middle vehicle has a satellite antenna on the roof. The kind used for encrypted communications, not standard GPS. 3 data points. Weapons. Boots. Vehicles. Individually, each one could be explained. Collectively, they painted a picture that made the hair on Graves' forearms stand up. Ivy was listening. She'd pulled Bishop's cut tighter around her shoulders, and her eyes moved between the bikers as they spoke, absorbing everything with the hyper-vigilant focus that had kept her alive for 3 days. "They're not FBI," she said. Every man in the kitchen looked at her. "Curtis made a call the second night, in the motel. He didn't know I could hear through the bathroom door. He said someone would come if anything went wrong. He called them the recovery team. He said they'd come with real paperwork and real badges, and that nobody had ever questioned them because they looked more legitimate than the actual agencies they were impersonating." The kitchen was silent, except for the hum of the freezer and the distant sound of wind against the back door. A recovery team. Purpose-built for exactly this scenario. An operator gets compromised, a route gets burned, and a team arrives with fabricated federal credentials and enough authority to extract the suspect and the witness before real law enforcement can verify anything. Logistics, contingency planning, operational redundancy. Harlan Poe's fingerprints were all over it. "Cortez is outside trying to verify," Graves said. "If she gets through to Denver, the real FBI will confirm they have no task force operating in this area tonight. And then those 6 men in our dining room become the most dangerous people we've ever been in a room with." "And if she doesn't get through?" Luca asked. "Then she comes back in with no confirmation either way, and has to make a judgment call. And those men out there are very, very good at looking like the right answer." Luca stepped closer. His voice dropped. "What's the play, Graves? Because in about 12 minutes, either Cortez verifies, and this becomes a firefight, Or she doesn't verify and she hands the girl over because the paperwork looks clean and she can't justify refusing. Either way, we're running out of road. Graves closed his eyes. The pressure behind them was immense. Not a headache, something deeper, something structural. The feeling of load-bearing walls taking more weight than they were designed for. He'd felt it in Helmand. He'd felt it in the collapsed building. The moment when the options narrow to two and neither one is survivable, but you have to pick anyway. He opened his eyes and looked at Ivy. "Do you trust me?" he asked. The question surprised her. He could see it. The slight widening of her eyes. The micro-flinch of someone unaccustomed to being asked rather than told. "You're the only person who listened," she said. "That's not what I asked." She looked at him, at the scar, at the silver in his beard, at the hands that had dug through rubble for 3 days and broken a trafficker's nose on a diner floor, at the tired eyes that had seen her napkin and decided in the space of a single heartbeat that she was worth protecting. "Yes," she said. Graves nodded. He turned to Dutch. "How fast can you get 3 bikes running?" "They're already warm. I had Possum keep them idling when the SUVs showed up." "Good. You, Possum, and Bishop take Ivy out the back." County Road 7 runs south behind the gas station. It's a dirt road, probably half buried, but the bikes can handle it. 4 miles south, it connects to Route 131. Take 131 to Yampa. There's a fire station in Yampa, staffed 24 hours. Get her inside, get her to someone with a radio that works, and call the real FBI field office in Denver. The number is 3036297171. Tell them you have a trafficking witness and that a recovery team using fabricated federal credentials is attempting extraction at Merle's Diner on Route 40. Dutch didn't hesitate. "And you?" "The rest of us stay here. We keep Warren and his men occupied long enough for you to get clear." "Occupied how?" "By being 12 uncooperative bikers who refuse to leave a diner." Luca grabbed Graves' arm. "If those men figure out she's gone, they won't play nice anymore. They'll stop pretending to be federal agents and start acting like what they actually are." "I know. You're talking about 9 guys against 6 armed men." "I know. Graves. The girl gets out. That's the only thing that matters. Everything else is negotiable." The words landed with the weight of a final order. Luca stared at him, not with argument, not with defiance, but with the raw, unguarded expression of a man looking at someone he loves and understanding that the person has made a choice that might kill them. "Okay," Luca said. Graves turned to Bishop. The old man was already on his feet, his trembling hands pulling on his gloves, his jaw set with a determination that briefly erased the decades and the drinking and the damage and showed the man underneath. The rider, the brother, the soldier, in all the ways that didn't require a uniform. "She doesn't leave your sight," Graves said. "Never," Bishop said. Ivy stood from the milk crate. Bishop's leather cut hung to her knees, her sneakers were still wet, her face was still bruised, and her eyes were still haunted. But she stood the way a person stands when they've been given something they haven't had in 3 days. A direction. Dutch moved to the back door, checked outside. Snow was falling lightly now. The storm's last breath. The parking lot behind the kitchen was empty except for a dumpster and the dark bulk of the gas station beyond. The sound of idling Harleys came from the far side of the building where Possum had positioned them, their engines muttering in the cold like low conversation. "Go," Graves said. Dutch opened the back door. Cold air rushed in. Ivy stepped toward it, then stopped. She turned back to Graves. "You knew him," she said. "In the war. You knew what he was, and you couldn't stop him then." Graves looked at her. "Stop him now." She walked out into the snow. Bishop followed. Dutch pulled the door shut behind them, and the kitchen was suddenly empty and quiet and cold. Graves stood motionless for 5 seconds, his hands hung at his sides. His breathing was steady. Inside his chest, something that had been locked for 16 years was turning like a key in a rusted mechanism, grinding against corrosion and scar tissue and years of carefully maintained distance from the man he used to be. Luca touched his shoulder. "Time to go be uncooperative," Luca said. They walked back into the dining room. Warren was standing near the counter, his arms crossed. His expression settled into the patient irritation of a man accustomed to bureaucratic delays, but not accustomed to being delayed by people who didn't answer to bureaucracies. His 5 men were spread across the diner in positions that had shifted subtly since Graves left. Tighter formation, closer to exits, hands resting on belts rather than hanging loose. They were preparing. Graves saw it and cataloged it the way he cataloged weather patterns and highway conditions, and the weight distribution of a Harley in a crosswind, automatically, continuously, as essential to survival as breathing. He sat down in the booth nearest the kitchen door. Luca sat across from him. The remaining bikers, 9 men, minus Dutch, Possum, and Bishop, redistributed themselves across the diner in a pattern that looked random but wasn't. 2 near the front windows, 2 at the counter, 3 in the back booths. Each man positioned where he could see at least 2 of Warren's team and be seen by at least 2 other lost saints. A web of sight lines, an architecture of presence. Warren noticed. Graves saw him notice. The slight head tilt, the narrowing of eyes, the rapid assessment of a man who had just realized the room's geometry had changed. "Your men seem restless," Warren said. "Long night, bad coffee." "Where'd the big guy go? And the old man?" "Smoke break." "In a blizzard?" "We're bikers. We smoke and everything." Warren held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then he turned to one of his men, the one nearest the kitchen, and spoke quietly. The man moved toward the swinging door. Luca was out of the booth before Graves could speak. "Kitchen's closed," Luca said, stepping into the man's path. The man, early 30s, broad, with a neck like a fire hydrant and the flat eyes of someone who solved problems with his hands, stopped 6 inches from Luca's chest. "I need to check the perimeter," the man said. "Back door's locked. Perimeter's fine." "Move." "No." The word was quiet. The energy behind it was not. Luca stood with his weight forward, his hands loose, his eyes locked on the man's face with the absolute stillness of a rattlesnake deciding whether the thing in front of it was worth striking. Warren appeared beside his man. "Easy, Marcus." He looked at Luca. "We're all on the same side here." "Then you won't mind waiting for the deputy to verify your paperwork?" "Of course not, but my team needs to secure all exits as part of standard protocol." "Your protocol doesn't include my kitchen." Warren's smile was gone now. What replaced it was something colder, the stripped-down expression of a man whose patience had run its course and whose contingency plans were activating. "I'm going to ask you one more time to step aside." Luca didn't move. Graves spoke from the booth. "Warren." The tall man turned. "Your team's weapons. SIG P320s, not standard bureau issue." The silence that followed was surgical. It cut through every pretense in the room and left them all standing in the exposed truth of what was actually happening. Warren looked at Graves, the mask, the smooth federal veneer, the practiced authority, the reasonable condescension, dissolved. What was underneath was still calm, still controlled, but it was a different kind of calm. The calm of a predator that has stopped pretending to be something else. "You're observant," Warren said. "I had a good teacher. You might know him. Harlan Poe." The name detonated, not visually. Warren didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't move. But every one of his men shifted, a collective micro-adjustment, like a machine switching modes. Hands moved to belts, weights shifted to front feet, eyes hardened. "I don't know who that is," Warren said. "Sure you do. He trained you, same way he trained me in a different desert. Logistics, contingency planning, operational redundancy, recovery teams that arrive with perfect paperwork. It's elegant. I have to give him that." "You're making a mistake." "I've made a lot of them. This isn't one." Warren looked around the diner. At the 9 bikers who had gone utterly still, their eyes fixed on his team with the collective focus of men who had survived bar fights and prison yards, and the specific kind of violence that teaches you how quickly a room can become a battlefield. "Where's the girl?" Warren asked. "In the kitchen." "Alone?" "With my guys." Warren turned to Marcus and the man beside the kitchen door. "Check it." Marcus moved. Luca held his ground. And then something broke open. The fragile equilibrium that had held the room together since Warren walked in shattered like the coffee pot Darla had dropped hours ago. Marcus grabbed Luca's shoulder to push him aside. Luca caught his wrist, twisted, and drove his elbow into Marcus's solar plexus. Marcus doubled over. The man beside him reached for his weapon, and the biker nearest the counter, a compact ex-Navy machinist named Deacon, hit him from the side with a shoulder tackle that drove both of them into the counter stools. The diner erupted. Warren drew his weapon and swept it toward Graves. Two bikers came off the back booth simultaneously, closing the distance before Warren could fix his aim. One of them, a towering former roughneck named Stokes, wrapped both hands around Warren's gun arm and pinned it against the wall. The weapon discharged, a deafening crack that punched through the front window and sent a spiderweb of fractures across the glass. Snow and cold air screamed through the hole. Graves was moving. Not toward Warren, toward the two men near the front door who were drawing weapons with the practiced speed of people who had done this before. He crossed 10 feet of diner floor in 3 strides, caught the first man's wrist as the gun came up, and redirected it toward the ceiling. The second shot of the night tore through an acoustic tile and sent a shower of dust and insulation down like dirty confetti. Luca had Marcus on the ground. The big man was struggling, powerful, trained, thrashing with the desperate strength of someone fighting in a room where he was outnumbered. Luca took an elbow to the mouth that split his lip and filled his mouth with copper. He spit blood on the linoleum and drove his knee into Marcus's back, pinning him. His hands found Marcus's gun arm and wrenched it behind his back at an angle that made the bigger man scream. "Stay down!" Luca hissed through bloody teeth. Deacon and the second man rolled across the floor, smashing into table legs, sending salt shakers and sugar dispensers scattering. The man got a hand free and swung, a compact, brutal hook that caught Deacon across the temple and sent stars exploding behind his eyes. Deacon absorbed it, grabbed the man's collar with both hands, and headbutted him. The crack was audible across the room. The man went limp. Graves grappled with the first man near the door. The agent was fast, faster than Graves expected, and trained in close-quarters combat. He drove a knee into Graves' thigh that deadened the muscle and nearly buckled his leg. Graves took the hit, shifted his weight, and wrapped the man in a clinch that pressed their bodies together so tightly the gun between them was useless. They staggered sideways, crashed into the gumball machine, and went down together in an avalanche of glass and colored candy that scattered across the bloody floor. The gun skittered away. Graves rolled on top, pinned the man's arms with his knees, and hit him once. A single, precise, devastating strike to the jaw that snapped the man's head sideways and turned his eyes to glass. Stokes still had Warren against the wall. The former roughneck's hands were enormous. Years of drilling rigs and pipe wrenches had turned them into instruments of crushing force, and he held Warren's gun arm immobilized while a second biker, a quiet man named Cole, stripped the weapon from Warren's fingers and cleared the chamber with practiced efficiency. Warren didn't struggle. He stood against the wall with Stokes' hand on his chest and Cole's hand on his weapon and looked at Graves across the wrecked diner with an expression that was not defeat. It was recalculation. "You have no idea what you've done," Warren said. Graves stood up from the man on the floor. His knuckles were bleeding. His thigh was cramping from the knee strike. A cut above his eyebrow was leaking blood into his left eye, and he wiped it with the back of his hand, leaving a red smear across his forehead. "I kept a girl safe," Graves said. "Same thing I've been doing all night." "You assaulted federal agents." "But I defended a diner full of people against armed men whose credentials don't verify, whose weapons aren't standard issue, and whose boots were purchased from the same catalog on the same day." Graves stepped closer. "You're not federal. You're Poe's recovery team, and the girl you came for is gone." Warren's expression shifted. The recalculation reached its conclusion, and what emerged was something Graves hadn't expected. Not anger, not desperation, but amusement. The cold, quiet amusement of a man who knows something you don't. "Gone where?" Warren asked. "Somewhere you won't find her." "The fire station in Yampa?" Warren said. The floor dropped out of Graves' stomach. "County Road 7 to 131 South to Yampa. It's the only route that makes sense from this location in these conditions. The fire station is the only 24-hour staffed facility within range. You'd need approximately..." Warren glanced at his watch. 18 minutes on those roads. Which means your people have a 12-minute head start. Graves stared at him. But we have vehicles, and they have motorcycles in the snow, and I have 2 more men who didn't come inside. Through the shattered front window, Graves heard it. Engines starting in the parking lot. Not Harleys. SUV engines. Powerful. The crunch of tires on ice as one of the black vehicles pulled out of the lot and turned south. Toward County Road 7. Toward Ivy. Graves turned to Luca. Their eyes met across the wrecked diner, across the blood and the broken glass and the scattered gumballs and the groaning men on the floor. And in that single look was an entire conversation, an entire history, an entire understanding of what had to happen next. Go, Graves said. Luca released Marcus, who collapsed flat on the linoleum. He sprinted for the front door, his boots skidding on blood and candy, his split lip trailing red. He hit the door at full speed and burst into the cold. Outside, the remaining Harleys sat in a row, their chrome glazed with frost, their engines cold. Luca swung onto his bike, a 2003 Road King that he'd rebuilt twice from salvage, and hit the starter. The engine coughed, turned, coughed again. "Come on," Luca whispered. His breath was white. Blood dripped from his chin onto the gas tank. His hands were shaking, not from fear, not from cold, but from the adrenaline dump of a man who had just fought 3 people in a diner and was now asking his motorcycle to save a girl's life. "Come on, come on, come on!" The engine caught, roared. The sound split the winter night like a war cry. 3 more bikers were behind him. Stokes, Cole, Deacon, with blood running from the welt on his temple. They mounted their bikes. Engines fired one by one, a rolling thunder that echoed off the gas station walls and the snow-covered plains beyond. Luca didn't wait. He kicked the Road King into gear and tore out of the lot, rear tire spinning on ice before catching asphalt. The bike fishtailed, corrected, and accelerated south on the shoulder of Route 40 toward the turnoff for County Road 7. Ahead, barely visible through the thinning snowfall, the red taillights of a black SUV were disappearing around the curve. Luca lowered his head against the wind. Ice crystals stung his face, and his split lip screamed. The Road King's engine bellowed beneath him, 2,000 pounds of American iron hammering through the dark. Behind him, 3 brothers rode in formation. No plan, no weapons, no authority. Just the sound of their engines and the knowledge that somewhere ahead, on a frozen dirt road in the middle of nowhere, Colorado, an old man and a giant and a 16-year-old girl were riding towards safety with wolves closing in behind them. Luca opened the throttle. The night swallowed him. Back in the diner, Graves stood in the wreckage. Blood on the floor, glass in his hair. Warren pinned against the wall. Marcus flat on the ground. 2 more of Poe's men restrained by bikers, zip-tied with cable ties from saddlebag kits. Cortez burst through the front door. She'd heard the shots. Her weapon was drawn, her eyes wild, scanning the chaos. "I got through," she shouted over the wind pouring through the shattered window. "Denver Field Office. There is no FBI trafficking task force operating in this area tonight. These men are not federal agents." "I know," Graves said. "I've got State Patrol and real FBI en route. ETA 40 minutes. "We don't have 40 minutes. He looked at Warren. "The girl is heading south on County Road 7 with 3 of my men. One of their vehicles is in pursuit. Your people need to redirect State Patrol to 131 South between here and Yampa." Cortez was already on her phone, shouting directions, coordinates, descriptions. The static was bad, but the connection held barely. The storm's dying gasp, giving them just enough signal to reach the outside world. Warren stood against the wall, watching. His face was unreadable. But his eyes, those flat, calculating, amused eyes, tracked Graves with the focus of a man who was not finished. "You know Poe will come for her," Warren said. "Not tonight, not this week, but eventually. You've disrupted a route, not a network. He'll rebuild. He always rebuilds." Graves looked at him. The blood was drying above his eyebrow. His hands were swelling. The cramp in his thigh had become a deep, throbbing ache that would take days to fade. "Then I'll be there when he does," Graves said. "You're 1 man." "I'm 12. Warren shook his head. The amusement was gone now, replaced by something almost like pity. You have no idea how deep this goes. Poe has people in agencies you've never heard of. He has roots across 14 states. He has law enforcement, judicial, and military contacts that would make your head spin. You stopped one truck on one highway on one night. Congratulations. Tomorrow, 3 more trucks move. Next week, 10. Graves stepped close to Warren, close enough to see the pores on the man's skin, the stubble on his jaw, the tiny capillaries in his eyes. Maybe, Graves said, but tonight, one girl is safe, and that's enough. Warren said nothing. Outside, the sound of Harleys faded south on the highway, swallowed by distance and darkness and the last whisper of the dying storm. Graves walked to the shattered window and looked out into the night. Somewhere on a frozen dirt road, his brothers were riding into the dark to catch a monster and protect a child, and he couldn't be with them. He was here, holding a diner together with willpower and bleeding knuckles, waiting for authorities who might arrive in time or might not. His phone buzzed. A text from Dutch. SUV gaining. Road is ice. Ivy is holding on. Graves stared at the screen. His hands shook. Not from cold, not from the fight, but from the specific helplessness of a man who has done everything he can and knows it might not be enough. He typed back 2 words. Luca's coming. Somewhere south, the roar of a road king cut through the frozen Colorado night like a promise that hadn't been broken yet. And on County Road 7, in the darkness between a dead highway and a fire station that might as well have been on the other side of the world, Bishop's Harley hit a patch of black ice. The bike went sideways, Ivy screamed, and the headlights of the SUV behind them grew brighter. Bishop's Harley slid across the black ice like a dying animal. 2,000 pounds of American steel rotating 45 degrees sideways, while the rear tire screamed against frozen gravel and found nothing. The old man's trembling hands, the same hands that shook over coffee mugs and cigarette lighters, and every small task his body had been failing at for the last decade, locked onto the handlebars with a strength that came from somewhere deeper than muscle, somewhere older, somewhere that remembered what it meant to hold on when the world was trying to throw you. Ivy's arms were clamped around his waist. She felt the bike tilt, felt the sickening sideways lurch, felt gravity reaching for them with cold fingers. Her scream was swallowed by the wind and the engine noise and the approaching roar of the SUV behind them. Bishop did the only thing a rider with 40 years on 2 wheels knows to do when ice takes the rear. He turned into the slide. His body shifted. The front wheel tracked left. The rear found a patch of frozen dirt beyond the ice and caught, barely, brutally, grinding the bike back upright with a jolt that nearly threw both of them over the handlebars. The Harley wobbled, steadied. Bishop opened the throttle and the engine bellowed back to life, launching them forward on the dark road with snow spraying from the rear tire like shrapnel. Behind them, the SUV's headlights were 200 yards back and closing. Dutch was riding point, 50 feet ahead of Bishop, his massive frame hunched over a Heritage Softail that looked too small for him. He'd heard the scream. He'd seen the headlights in his mirror, growing, multiplying, eating the distance between them. He checked his speedometer. 43 miles per hour on a dirt road glazed with ice in the dark. The SUV could do twice that. Math didn't favor them. Possum rode beside Dutch, his graying ponytail whipping behind him, his bad leg aching against the foot peg. He'd been calculating the distance to Yampa since they left the diner. 4 miles south on County Road 7, then east on 131. They were 2 miles in, 2 miles to go before the paved road, and the SUV was gaining at a rate that would close the gap before they reached the turn. Dutch hand signaled, a sharp downward chop, then a sweep to the right. Possum read it instantly. They'd ridden together for 7 years. They thought in formation the way birds think in flocks. The road ahead curved around a low ridge where the county had cut through a hillside years ago, leaving steep embankments on both sides. A narrow passage, single lane, the kind of place where a motorcycle could fit but an SUV would have to slow down. Dutch accelerated into the curve. Possum followed. Bishop brought up the rear with Ivy pressed against his back, her face buried in his leather cut, her fingers white-knuckled against the fabric. They made the curve. The road narrowed between the cut banks. Rock walls rose on either side, close enough to touch. Dutch braked hard, stopped, swung his Heritage sideways across the road, and killed the engine. Possum pulled up beside him. Same maneuver. Two Harleys now blocked the narrow passage like a barricade of chrome and leather, and the bodies of two men who had decided, without discussion, that this was where they would stand. Go, Dutch said to Bishop as the old man's Harley idled behind the barricade. Yampa, don't stop. Bishop looked at them. At Dutch, the massive, quiet combat medic who spoke 50 words a week and meant everyone. At Possum, the graying Vietnam-era rider with the bad leg and the pale blue eyes and the steady hands of a man who'd stopped being afraid of dying sometime around 1971. I'll come back for you, Bishop said. Don't, Possum said. Get the girl to the fire station, that's all that matters. Bishop nodded once, gunned the throttle. The Harley surged past the barricade and disappeared around the next curve, carrying Ivy Mercer toward Yampa, with the desperation of a man who understood that the most important thing he would ever do in his life was happening right now, on this frozen road, in this dying storm. Dutch and Possum sat on their bikes in the narrow cut and waited. The SUV's headlights appeared around the curve, bright, blinding. The vehicle was moving fast, too fast for the conditions, and when the driver saw the two motorcycles blocking the road, the brakes locked. The SUV fishtailed, tires shrieking on ice, and skidded to a stop 30 feet from the barricade. Silence. The engine idled. The headlights pinned Dutch and Possum in white light, turning them into silhouettes. Two men on two machines, motionless, blocking the road like something out of a myth nobody had written yet. The SUV's doors opened. Two men got out. The ones Warren said hadn't come inside the diner. They were younger than the others, late 20s, athletic, moving with the coiled efficiency of men who trained daily and fought regularly. One held a flashlight. The other held something that glinted. Move your bikes, the one with the flashlight said. Dutch said nothing. I said move. Possum reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a road flare. He struck it against the asphalt. It ignited with a hiss and a burst of red light that turned the snow-covered road into something from a fever dream. The rock walls glowing crimson, the falling snowflakes turning pink, the chrome of the Harleys burning red like heated metal. He held the flare at arm's length, the red light painting his weathered face and pale eyes in the colors of a dying fire. Road's closed, Possum said. The men looked at each other, looked at the barricade, looked at the rock walls on either side. What? Too steep to climb, too narrow to drive around. There are two of you, the one with the glinting object said, and two of us. Yeah, Dutch said. It was the most words he'd spoken in a single conversation in weeks. But we don't have anywhere to be. 4 minutes. That's how long it took. 4 minutes of standoff in the red light of a road flare on a frozen dirt road in northern Colorado, while Bishop's Harley disappeared south carrying a girl toward safety. 4 minutes during which the two men from the SUV calculated and recalculated and ultimately reached the same conclusion that every predator reaches when confronted with prey that won't run. The cost exceeds the benefit. When they heard the sirens, distant, approaching from the north, the sound of state patrol units that Cortez had dispatched, the two men got back in the SUV. Reversed. Disappeared north up County Road 7, their taillights shrinking to red pinpoints before vanishing entirely. Dutch and Possum sat on their bikes in the dark. The flare burned down to nothing. The road went black except for starlight breaking through the dissolving storm clouds overhead. You think Bishop made it? Possum asked. He made it. Possum nodded, reached into his cut and pulled out a cigarette. Lit it with the same lighter he'd carried since 1969, a battered brass Zippo with a faded insignia on the case that he never explained to anyone. The flame caught, and for a moment his face was visible, tired, lined, steady. My leg's killing me, he said. Yep. Could use a drink. Yep. They sat there and smoked and waited for the sirens to arrive. 6 miles south, Bishop's Harley pulled into the parking lot of the Yampa fire station at 3:47 in the morning. The engine died with a cough and a rattle that suggested the old bike had given everything it had and would need serious attention before it gave anything more. Bishop climbed off. His legs buckled. He caught himself on the handlebar and stayed upright through sheer refusal to fall in front of the girl. Ivy slid off the back of the bike and stood in the parking lot on legs that felt like they belonged to a marionette. The fire station was a small brick building with a single bay, an American flag hanging limp in the still air, and warm light glowing through a window. Bishop walked to the door and knocked. It opened. A firefighter in his 50s with a gray mustache and a coffee mug looked at them. An old biker with blood on his knuckles and a teenage girl in an oversized leather cut, both of them shaking, both of them covered in road grime and sweat and snow. "I need your radio," Bishop said, "and I need you to call the FBI." 2 hours later, the sun began to rise over Route 40. The storm was gone. The sky was clear for the first time in 36 hours. A pale, washed-out blue that looked like the color of exhaustion itself. Snow covered everything. The highway, the gas station, the parking lot of Merle's diner, the chrome motorcycles lined up outside like soldiers after a battle. Inside the diner, the damage was comprehensive. Shattered front window patched with cardboard and duct tape, hole in the ceiling, blood on the linoleum, some of it Curtis's, some of it Luca's, some of it Graves', some of it belonging to men who were now handcuffed in the backs of 3 different law enforcement vehicles outside. Broken glass swept into piles but not yet removed. The gumball machine was destroyed. The jukebox had somehow survived. FBI agents, real ones, with verifiable credentials and standard-issue Glocks, and the bureaucratic patience of people who had been woken at 3 in the morning and driven through a blizzard, filled the diner. They were processing the scene, photographing evidence, interviewing witnesses. Curtis Phelps had been transported to a federal holding facility in Denver under armed escort. Coulter was in separate custody, talking. Not much, but enough. The 6 men from Warren's team were in handcuffs, their fake credentials and satellite communicators bagged and tagged. Warren himself sat in the back of an FBI vehicle, silent, his face unreadable, his amusement finally extinguished. Cortez stood outside the diner with a cup of coffee she'd been holding for 20 minutes without drinking. Her uniform was wrinkled, her eyes were bloodshot. She'd been awake for 22 hours and had arrested her own colleague and helped dismantle a trafficking operation and was now processing the emotional aftermath of all of it with the stoic efficiency of someone who would collapse later, in private, where nobody could see. Graves sat in the booth nearest the patched window. His hands were wrapped in gauze. Ramirez had cleaned and bandaged the cuts from the fight. The welt above his eyebrow had been butterflied shut. His thigh ached. His back ached. Everything ached with the deep cellular fatigue of a man who had burned through every reserve his body possessed and was now running on fumes and coffee and the stubborn refusal to lie down before the job was done. Luca sat across from him. His lip was swollen to twice its normal size, split in 2 places, held together with butterfly bandages that made him look like a boxer after a bad round. His knuckles were wrapped. His eyes were closed. He wasn't sleeping. His jaw was too tight for sleep. But he was resting in the way combat veterans rest, a surface stillness that masks a system still running at full alert. The diner door opened. Cold air and pale sunlight flooded in. Ivy walked through it. Behind her was a woman in her early 40s with brown hair and swollen eyes and a face that looked like it had been crying for 3 days straight. She was holding Ivy's hand with both of hers, gripping it so tightly that her knuckles were white, as if releasing the girl's fingers would cause her to disappear again. Ivy's mother, Sarah Mercer. She'd driven through the night from Grand Junction the moment Cortez reached her. 4 hours on icy highways in a 12-year-old Honda Civic with bald tires and a heater that only worked on the driver's side. She'd arrived at the Yampa fire station at 5:15 in the morning and collapsed in the parking lot, falling to her knees in the snow, and held her daughter so tightly that the firefighter with the gray mustache had to look away because even after 30 years of emergencies, some things are too raw to witness. Now they stood in the doorway of Merle's diner. Ivy and Bishop's leather cut. Sarah in a coat she'd grabbed without looking, mismatched gloves, snow boots that hadn't been laced properly because her hands had been shaking too badly to tie them. Every biker in the diner stood, not because anyone told them to, not because it was protocol or tradition or any conscious decision. They stood because a mother had walked into a room with a daughter she'd gotten back from the dark, and standing was the only response their bodies knew how to make. Sarah Mercer looked at them, at the scarred faces, the bandaged hands, The leather cuts and road-worn boots and tattoos and the exhaustion that hung off them like Spanish moss. And her face did something complicated. Gratitude and fear and awe and the bewildered disbelief of a woman who had spent 3 days begging every authority she could reach for help and received nothing, and then 12 strangers on motorcycles had done what the entire apparatus of American law enforcement had failed to do. She opened her mouth, closed it. Her chin trembled. Graves spoke first because he could see she was about to break apart, and he wanted to spare her the embarrassment of crying in front of strangers, even though every man in the room would have understood. "She's tough," Graves said. "She saved herself. We just made sure nobody stopped her." Sarah looked at him, at the gauze on his hands, the butterfly bandage above his eye, the silver in his beard and the scar on his face, and the tired eyes that held hers without flinching. "Thank you," she said. 2 words. They came out broken and insufficient and enormous. Graves nodded, said nothing more. He sat back down in the booth and picked up his coffee and looked out the cardboard-patched window at the snow-covered highway and the pale morning sky. Luca opened his eyes. He watched Ivy and her mother sit down in a booth on the far side of the diner, where an FBI victim advocate was waiting with paperwork and a warm blanket and the careful, practiced gentleness of a professional whose entire job was helping people begin to recover from things that shouldn't happen. Ivy looked across the diner and caught Luca's eye. She didn't wave, didn't nod, didn't mouth the words "thank you" or anything else. She just looked at him, a 16-year-old girl looking at a 29-year-old ex-con with a split lip and a dead sister and 4 years of prison behind him. And in that look was something that neither of them would ever be able to articulate, but both of them would carry for the rest of their lives. Recognition. The specific, unbreakable recognition of 2 people who have survived similar darkness and found each other on the other side. Luca looked away first. His jaw clenched. His throat worked. He picked up his coffee and drank it, even though it was cold and tasted like ash. Outside, Dutch and Possum pulled into the lot on their Harleys. They'd ridden back from County Road 7 after the state patrol secured the area. Possum's bad leg was stiff enough that he needed Dutch's arm to dismount. They walked inside without fanfare, sat down at the counter, and Darla, who had somehow stayed through the entire night and was still wiping the same stretch of counter she'd been wiping 12 hours ago, poured them coffee without a word. Bishop arrived next. He'd ridden from Yampa slowly, nursing the old Harley, giving its exhausted engine the gentle treatment of a man who understood that the machine had given him everything it had when he needed it most. He sat beside Graves in the booth. His hands were trembling again. The normal tremor, the one that never stopped, the one that reminded him every hour of every day that his body was failing in ways his spirit refused to accept. "She's safe," Bishop said. "I know. Her mother's a mess. She'll hold together. Mothers do." Bishop looked at his hands, at the tremor, at the scarred, liver-spotted skin and the swollen knuckles. "I almost lost it on that ice," he said quietly. "Almost dropped the bike. Almost lost her. But you didn't. The bike saved us, caught a patch of dirt at the last second. That wasn't the bike." Bishop looked at him. Graves looked back. The moment held. 2 men who had been riding together for 9 years, who had buried friends and survived storms and sat in hospital waiting rooms and never once said the words that mattered because they didn't need to. The writing said it. The presence said it. The fact that they were still here, still breathing, still sitting in the same booth in a wrecked diner at sunrise, said everything words would only diminish. The FBI lead agent, a sharp-eyed woman named Torres from the Denver field office, approached Graves's booth. She had a tablet in one hand and a look on her face that fell somewhere between respect and professional caution. "Mr. Callahan, I need to talk about Harlan Poe." Graves set his coffee down. "Sit." Torres sat. She pulled up a file on her tablet. "Based on the information you and the witness provided, we've issued a federal warrant for Poe's arrest. We've also initiated an investigation into the network, the pickup points, the routes, the compromised law enforcement contacts. Coulter is cooperating. Curtis Phelps' phone was seized intact. Your Polaroid trick bought us enough time to get it into an evidence locker before anyone could wipe it remotely. There are 11 names on that phone, 11 operators across 6 states. Graves listened. His face gave nothing away. The manila folder from the truck, Torres continued. Photographs of 14 girls. We've identified 8 so far. 3 are in active missing persons databases. 2 have been located alive in the last 4 hours based on route information from the phone. 2 girls, found alive, because a teenager wrote 4 words on a napkin in a dying diner. Graves blinked. It was the only visible reaction he allowed himself. But Luca, who had been listening from the next booth, saw the blink and understood what it cost. The compression of something enormous into something invisible. The way Graves processed emotion, the way he processed everything, internally, structurally, in silence. And Poe? Graves asked. Torres hesitated. The hesitation told Graves everything before she spoke. Gone. His last known location was a rental property in Cheyenne, Wyoming. By the time we got agents there, it was empty, cleaned professionally. No prints, no electronics, no paper trail. He's in the wind. Graves nodded slowly. He'd expected it. Poe was a logistics expert, a man who planned contingencies for his contingencies. He would have had an extraction protocol, a bag packed, documents ready, a route planned for exactly this scenario. The moment Warren's team went dark, Poe would have known the Colorado operation was compromised and initiated his disappearance. We'll find him, Torres said. This is the biggest break we've had in human trafficking in the Mountain West in 5 years. The phone data alone will keep us busy for months. And when we find him, you'll arrest him, process him, put him in a system that let him operate for years while people filed reports that went nowhere. Torres's jaw tightened. That's not... It is. I reported him in 2010 through military channels. The report was filed, acknowledged, and buried. If someone had listened then, those 14 girls in that manila folder would never have been photographed. The sentence sat between them like an accusation and a wound at the same time. Torres held his gaze. She didn't apologize. She was smart enough to know that an apology from one federal agent couldn't cover the failure of an entire system, but something in her eyes acknowledged the truth of what he'd said. The system failed, she said. I can't fix what happened before. I can work with what's in front of me now. Graves looked at her for a long time. Then he reached into his cut pocket and pulled out the napkin. The original one. 4 smeared words in desperate handwriting on a diner napkin stained with coffee rings. He's not my family. He set it on the table. Start there, he said. Torres took the napkin with both hands, looked at it, looked at Graves. Then she stood and walked away with it, carrying it like something that weighed more than paper. The morning deepened. Light poured through the diner's remaining windows and turned the snow outside into a blinding white field that hurt to look at. One by one, the FBI agents finished their work, packed their equipment, and left. Cortez shook Graves's hand outside the diner, a firm, brief handshake between 2 people who had been through something together and would never fully explain it to anyone who hadn't been there. If you need anything, Cortez said, I know where to find you. She almost smiled. It didn't quite reach her eyes, but it was close. She got in her cruiser and drove north toward Craig with Ramirez beside her and an empty seat in the back where Coulter used to sit. Ivy and her mother were the last to leave. The FBI escort waited outside. 2 vehicles, real agents, verified credentials. They would drive Sarah's Honda back to Grand Junction while a secure vehicle transported Ivy and her mother to a safe location where the formal debriefing process would begin. Ivy stopped at the door. She turned back and looked at the bikers who remained. Graves in his booth with his gauze-wrapped hands and his tired eyes. Luca at the counter with his split lip and his swollen knuckles. Dutch standing by the window like a monument. Possum nursing his bad leg on a stool. Bishop trembling in his booth, exhausted beyond description, still upright. And the others, Stokes, Cole, Deacon, and the rest, scattered across the diner in various states of damage and fatigue, each one of them carrying the weight of a night that would live inside them permanently. Broken men, every one of them, scarred and flawed and haunted by things they'd done and things done to them and things they'd failed to prevent. Men who drank too much and slept too little and rode too far and carried guilt like extra weight on their motorcycles. Men nobody trusted. Men the world looked at and saw danger, not safety. But they had stood between her and the dark. When every institution failed, when every badge was suspect, when every authority figure was compromised or absent or indifferent, 12 men with nothing but leather and engines and the stubborn, furious, unbreakable conviction that a girl they'd never met deserved to survive. Ivy walked to Graves' booth. She reached up and unclasped the small silver bell that hung from the zipper of Bishop's leather cut. A guardian bell, the kind bikers hang on their motorcycles. Old tradition, old meaning. She'd noticed it hours ago, had been holding it through every terrifying moment on the bike, had felt its weight against her palm like an anchor. She set it on the table in front of Graves. "I don't need it," she said. "I already know I survived." Graves looked at the bell, looked at her. His eyes were bright. Not with tears, because men like Graves had sealed those channels shut a long time ago, but with something equally powerful. The recognition that the girl standing in front of him was going to be okay. Not today, not next week, but eventually, because she had the one thing that survival requires and that no one can give you, the willingness to keep standing after the world has tried to put you on the floor. "Keep it anyway," Graves said. He pushed the bell back toward her. "Not because you need reminding, because someday you'll meet someone who does." Ivy picked up the bell, held it in her closed fist. Then she turned and walked out the door into the morning light, where her mother was waiting beside the FBI vehicle with tears still wet on her face and arms already open. The diner door swung shut. Graves sat alone in the booth. The morning light was warm now, cutting through the remaining window glass at a low angle that turned the coffee in his mug to liquid amber. The jukebox, surviving against all odds, clicked and hummed and began playing a song nobody had selected. Some old country ballad with a pedal steel guitar that sounded like loneliness made musical. He drank his coffee. It was fresh. Darla had made a new pot somewhere in the last hour, and it was the first good coffee he'd had all night. He let the warmth fill his hands, his chest, the hollow places behind his ribs that had been cold for 16 years. Luca slid into the booth across from him. His lip had stopped bleeding. His eyes were calmer now. Still intense, still carrying the voltage of a man wired for war, but the kill line had dropped. The fire was banked, controlled, the way it needed to be for him to keep living in a world that required something other than fury. "Torres said they found 2 girls," Luca said. "I heard." "Alive?" "I heard." Luca stared at his coffee. His jaw worked. The muscle in his neck jumped once, twice, then went still. "It doesn't bring her back," he said. "Marisol." "No." "But it matters." "Yeah, it does." Luca nodded. He picked up his coffee, drank it, set it down. His hands were steady for the first time all night. Outside, the bikers began preparing to leave. Saddlebags repacked. Engines checked. Oil levels inspected with the careful ritual of men who trusted their machines the way other people trusted relationships. Completely, vulnerably, knowing that the thing carrying you could fail at any moment but choosing to ride anyway. Dutch tightened a bolt on his heritage. Possum stretched his bad leg against his bike's foot peg, grimacing, then swung on with the practiced ease of a man who'd been ignoring pain since before most of his brothers were born. Bishop sat on his Harley with his eyes closed, his trembling hands resting on the gas tank, feeling the cold metal warm slowly beneath his palms. Stokes and Cole and Deacon and the rest mounted up one by one, their engines starting in sequence, a rolling cascade of sound that began as individual growls and merged into a single, unified roar that shook the snow off the diner's remaining window panes. Graves walked outside last. The morning air was sharp and clean, scrubbed pure by the storm. The sun sat low on the eastern horizon, turning the snowfields gold and the sky a color that didn't have a name, somewhere between blue and white, and the feeling you get when you've been awake for 30 hours and the world looks both impossibly real and slightly fictional. He stood beside his Harley, a 2001 Road King with 187,000 miles on the odometer and more repair history than most emergency rooms. The leather seat was cold. The chrome was frosted. The guardian bell hanging from the frame was silent in the still air. He mounted up, hit the starter. The engine caught on the first try. It always caught on the first try, the one reliable thing in a life built on uncertainty. and settled into the deep, familiar idol that had been his heartbeat for the last 16 years. The vibration traveled up through the frame, through the seat, through his spine, and into the base of his skull, where it met the permanent hum of Helmand, and for the first time in his memory, didn't fight it. The two sounds existed together. The engine and the war, the present and the past, the man he was and the man he'd been. He could live with that. Darla came out of the diner. She stood in the parking lot in her waitress uniform with a dish towel over her shoulder and her eyes squinting against the morning sun. She looked at the bikers. 12 machines, 12 men, a formation of scarred leather and gleaming chrome arranged in the parking lot of a diner she'd worked at for decades and would never think of the same way again. "You forgot to pay for your coffee," she said. Graves reached into his cut and pulled out a fold of bills. He didn't count them. He handed them to Darla and closed her fingers around them. "For the window, too," he said. Darla looked at the bills, looked at him. Her chin did the thing chins do when the person attached to them is trying very hard not to cry. "You come back sometime," she said. "I'll make better coffee." "I'll hold you to that." Graves pulled out of the lot first. The Road King's tires crunched on frozen gravel, then found asphalt, and the bike accelerated onto Route 40 with the smooth, heavy momentum of something that belongs to the highway the way rivers belong to valleys. Behind him, one by one, the Lost Saints followed. Luca next, his Road King falling into position on Graves' left quarter, the road captain's slot, the eyes and ears position, the place in formation reserved for the man who watches everything and misses nothing. Then Dutch, then Possum, then Bishop, his old Harley running rough but running, carrying him forward on an engine and a will that refused to quit. Then Stokes and Cole and Deacon and the rest, each bike finding its place in the formation with the unconscious precision of men who had ridden together long enough that the formation was less a pattern and more a language. 12 Harleys on an open highway at sunrise. The sound carried for miles. Across snow-covered fields and frozen fences and the empty parking lots of closed gas stations and the windows of farmhouses where people were just beginning to stir. It carried through the cold air like a declaration, not of victory, not of triumph, but of presence. We were here. We did this. We are riding away now, and the world is slightly different because we passed through it. Graves rode with his hands steady on the bars and his eyes on the road, and the sunrise filling his visor with gold. Behind his eyes, the noise, the permanent 16-year hum of Helmand, of rubble and static, and the voices of men who didn't make it, was quieter than it had been in his memory. Not gone. It would never be gone. But quieter. Pushed back by the engine beneath him, and the brothers behind him, and the memory of a girl's voice saying, "I already know I survived." He didn't know what came next. Poe was in the wind. The network was damaged but not destroyed. Torres and the FBI would work the case for months, maybe years, chasing names across state lines and building prosecutions that would move through the courts with agonizing slowness. Some operators would be caught, some would vanish, some girls would be found. Some wouldn't. The world didn't fix itself in one night. Graves knew that. He'd learned it in a country on the other side of the planet and relearned it on American highways and in hospital rooms and in the silence of 3 a.m. motel rooms where the only sounds were his own breathing and the ice machine down the hall. But one girl was safe. One girl was in a car with her mother, heading home, holding a silver bell in her closed fist. And 12 broken men were riding west into a Colorado sunrise, their engines singing the only song they knew. The low, guttural, unbeautiful hymn of machines built to carry damaged people long distances without asking why. The highway stretched ahead, empty and white and infinite. Graves opened the throttle. The Lost Saints rode on, and somewhere behind them, in a diner with a patched window and a hole in the ceiling and blood still drying on the floor, a jukebox played to an empty room while a waitress counted a fold of bills and cried quietly into a dish towel, and the morning light poured in through broken glass and made everything, the blood, the coffee stains, the scattered gumballs, the small and enormous evidence of a night that had changed everything, look almost like gold.